My name is Heather, and we are streaming the 1993 Menendez brothers trial. This is California versus Eric and Lyle Menendez, who are on trial for, or were on trial for the homicide of their parents, who treated them very, very badly. We are in the defense's case now, and we are learning just how badly they were treated. And we're also learning the effects from these experts, what that mistreatment can do to a child as they are developing and growing. So, to continue on with that conversation, we have Dr. Ann Tyler. This is part one of two. So, let us begin.
My name is Dr. Ann H. Tyler, Tyler.
Dr. Tyler, what sort of doctor are you?
I'm a doctor of psychology. I have a PhD in psychology.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a practicing psychologist with a private practice. I'm affiliated with a group called the Utah Institute for Psychotherapy and Training. I'm on the professional staff at the Western Institute of Neuropsychiatry in Salt Lake City.
What do you do for the Western Institute of Neuropsychology in Salt Lake City?
I act as a consultant. I do some inpatient work. I do some supervision of residents from the University of Utah College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. I also have an adjunct professorship at the University of Utah in the Department of Educational Psychology.
And do you teach courses at the University of Utah?
I teach an occasional course on family systems therapy.
What is family systems therapy?
Family systems therapy, it's a way of evaluating and assessing families, the way one looks at family interactions.
Okay. Is that the extent of your occupational activities?
Not really. I do extensive training and present workshops to a variety of people. I've presented workshops on child abuse, identification, evaluation, treatment issues of child abuse, child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, psychological maltreatment. I present to other professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, judges.
Let me interrupt you for a second before you complete who you do this training and workshopping with. Is the basic focus of your educating and training at this time in the area of family interactions and child abuse?
My basic training, or
No,
the training that I do?
The teaching that you do, the training that you do.
Well, the training that I do is primarily in the area of identification,
Of what?
child abuse, evaluation of child abuse.
When you say evaluating child abuse, who do you evaluate?
Well, this is two-pronged. It's evaluating both the individual child, adolescent, or youth, and evaluating the family system of that child, adolescent, or young adult, or youth.
Okay. So you were saying that your basic training that you give people is in identifying child abuse, evaluating child abuse.
And treatment issues.
Treating child abuse?
Treating child abuse.
And in your private practice, do you treat children, adolescents, youths, adults who were abused as children?
I do.
And approximately how many patient hours have you spent in your clinical practice treating people for child abuse-related issues?
When I put a pencil to this and tried to figure it out, it turns out to be about 10,000 hours, patient hours, in my life that I have spent in this area.
Treating the effects, the after effects of child abuse?
Yes, and I don't treat that just exclusively. I also treat mood disorders, affective disorders.
And in your work with people suffering from mood disorders and affective disorders, are those linked to child abuse, or are they also caused by other things?
They're also caused by other things, and of course, it all depends upon the individual and the situation and what kinds of information that you're able to elicit and get from a very comprehensive history of the child and or the adolescent and or the adult. Very frequently, this problem does not come to one's attention until an individual is in their 20s, 30s, even 40s.
Which problem are you referring to?
The problem of child abuse or severe depression or anxiety, which disables people, those kinds of things.
And those are issues that you as a therapist have come across in people in their 20s or 30s that have not been addressed earlier in their life?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Now, with respect to the teaching that you do and the workshops, you had started to tell us to what groups or what types of people you have been called upon to teach in the area of identification, evaluation, and treatment of child abuse. And why don't you tell us what groups and types of people you've been asked to speak to?
Well, in addition to the students, the graduate students at the University of Utah, I have presented to judicial conferences in the state of Utah. I have presented with the Attorney General's office at the American Psychological Association National Meeting in Boston, Massachusetts. I have presented at the International Congress on Child Abuse and Neglect, one conference that was held in Paris, France, another which was more recently held in Australia.
Have you been called upon to train and educate police officers who investigate abuse and family violence cases?
Yes, I have. I had a contract with the state to present to police officers and child protective service workers who do the investigations and the initial interviews of child abuse and neglect.
Wow. Have you presented
She trains law enforcement to recognize these signs and to treat and to identify. So that's that's pretty stellar. I mean, you're a pretty stellar witness if you're the one that's already training law enforcement, in my opinion. And then if you look at the state's case, their expert witness, if you can even call him an expert in anything, was Dr. Oziel. I think he's an expert in weaseling his way out of answering questions and also just being an overall douche.
lectures and training to any state agencies?
Yes, I have.
You've mentioned
The Human Services, Family Services, Division of Family Services in Utah.
I take it you live and practice in the state of Utah.
You're right. I have presented in other states, but I primarily try to spend as much of my time in Utah.
Now, what is your educational background leading up to your doctorate in psychology?
I have a Bachelor's of Arts degree with a major in psychology, a minor in education. I have a master's degree in psychology with an emphasis upon child, youth, family assessment. I have a doctoral degree in psychology with an emphasis upon child evaluations, forensic interviewing, clinical psychology, basically.
Okay. And have you done any work postdoctoral?
Yes, I have.
And what was that?
Well, once I finished my PhD, then I did a supervised residency at a child abuse agency. I also did some work at Primary Children's Hospital, which is located in Salt Lake City, and was supervised with residency work there. And then, of course, in addition, as all licensed psychologists are required, we are required to keep our expertise updated with Utah requires 30 hours, 30 additional educational hours that must be completed within a 24-month period. And so I am constantly or consistently updating my knowledge base.
It appears from what you've told us that the emphasis throughout your professional, both educational preparation and practice, has been on the family and on children.
It has been primarily.
Have you received any governmental grants to do research or to provide treatment services to families and children?
Yes, I have.
And would you describe what those were?
In 1976, I believe it was, I had the opportunity to write a grant in association with someone from the Division of Family Services through Utah State Social Services to establish a crisis intervention service, really a crisis nursery for children and their families in an effort to look at prevention and to track that. There was a research component written with that.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean? You were going to do research at this?
As we opened the facility, we were also interested in looking at if child abuse could be prevented, if families were impacted early enough, if families were given the resources, if children were given the resources early in the child's life, if that would, in fact, prevent the long-term consequences of child abuse.
And when you say a family impact, did you mean connect with people outside the family who could help them?
Yes.
And when you say if the children were given the resources, what do you mean by resources in that context?
Well, when you look at a child, particularly a young child or an individual, you assess that child, that individual, within the context of their family, within the context of their school, within the context of their community.
I mean, you try to understand?
You try to understand this individual's world, because we don't live in vacuums, and we know that experiences shape how we think, how we view the world, how we behave.
Okay. And so...
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Your Honor,
That's been
may I?
used by somebody else. We'll get you a first class.
Thank you.
Don't want to give you new experiences here that you're not ready for. Okay. When you talk about, you're talking about trying to understand this child in the context of their family, with relation to their family, their school. What were the resources, though, that this nursery shelter was going to provide that could somehow have an effect on whether there'd be continuing abuse or whether there'd be long-term effects of the abuse? Well, you used the word resources, and I just wanted to know what you meant.
Well, at this particular resource,
Doing it again.
thank you very much. We were initially able to provide only respite care. That means emergency care for the child.
You mean like food and shelter and medical attention?
Food and shelter and medical attention. In addition to that, we were also committed to providing, and were able to provide, intervention for the parent.
Dr. Tyler, you're using words that I understand. They're the words of the field, but I'm trying to get them down to Webster's.
Yeah.
When you say intervention for the parent, do you mean
Support for the
therapy?
parent, education for the parent, referring the parent into one of our parenting groups, into one of our support groups,
Okay.
into their own therapy, into family therapy. Is that helpful?
That helps. So
Sorry.
you recognize these families where children are being abused have a problem, and the way you approach the solution are support groups, education, therapy. Is that
Yes.
the basics?
I think that's the basics. I probably missed something, but I'll think of it.
Okay. So you had received a grant to establish this nursery. You got the money?
We got the money. I didn't do it alone. I can't take full credit. I had a lot of assistance and support from the community. It was a community effort.
And is it still going?
It is. We now have 8 in the state of Utah, and the model has been replicated in other parts of the country.
So other states.
Variations on the theme.
So other states have now established these kinds of crisis intervention nurseries.
That's correct.
And with respect to the research aspect of this, did the research lead to any significant or useful information about early intervention?
Well, we're continuing. We have a longitudinal study going, meaning we have a study that is continuing long-term to evaluate what happens to these children and these families as the children grow up, to see if the interventions we've provided if they help. The preliminary data looks promising. It looks as if we're doing something to help.
Now, in addition to your private practice and the teaching that you do you also contribute to the literature,
I
the
do.
professional literature on child abuse?
I do. When I have time to write, I write.
And what sort of publications have you been published in?
Oh, I've been published in the International Journal on Family Violence, in the International Child Abuse Journal, in the School Psychology Review, American Psychologist, the usual academic professional journals that I read and contribute to.
And in addition to writing for these journals, are you familiar with the writings of other psychologists, psychiatrists, and professionals in the field of the identification, evaluation, and treatments of child abuse?
Yes, I am.
And is that one of the things that you devote your 30 hours every 24 months to keeping current on?
That's correct.
You currently have a private practice, is that correct?
Yes, I
And
do.
are you currently treating adolescent victims of child abuse?
I am.
Are you treating adults who were child and adolescent
I
victims
am.
of child abuse?
Yes.
Have you, in addition to treating victims of child abuse, have you done evaluations of individuals to see if they meet the criteria of abused as children persons for courts? In other words, have you done forensic evaluations?
That's a very complex question that just can't be answered with a yes or a no.
Okay, well, let me ask
Because
you. What? Sorry.
That assumes, the way I'm interpreting it in my head, it assumes that child abuse is a diagnosis of a mental illness, and it's not. It's,
That's not what I meant. I mean, have
Okay.
you done work, first of all, have you testified before in court?
oh yes,
Have you been qualified as an expert witness?
Yes,
in
I
courts?
have.
And how many times have you qualified as an expert witness?
many times.
And what was the area of your testimony, basically? What was the topic of your testimony?
The topic of my testimony was the evaluation, typically it's the evaluation of an individual's statement as to the fact that they had been physically abused, sexually abused, emotionally abused. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think that was my convoluted question, that you have done that in other cases.
I have.
And in those cases, when you have done that, have you solely appeared on behalf of one side or the other side in litigation? In other words, are you always, say in civil cases, a plaintiff's expert, or are you always a
Oh, no.
defense expert?
No. I'm often asked, as a friend of the court,
mean, for the court's
benefit, to examine the situation and
what-
give an opinion.
Okay, and are you sometimes asked by one side or the other
I
of
am.
the adversary?
Yes, I am.
And have you been involved in both civil and criminal cases?
I have.
Have you been involved in other kinds of cases? Domestic, dependency, those kinds of cases?
No, it's primarily abuse cases.
Have you ever been involved in doing an evaluation of a family for divorce court for custody issues?
Yes, I have.
And that dealt with whether or not there was abuse occurring?
Not always, sometimes, but not always.
So you have testified or done evaluations in domestic court as well, or what
Yes,
we call
I have.
family law court
Yes,
here
I
in
have.
California. How many criminal cases have you been involved with?
I can't answer that question. Quite a few.
More than 5?
Yes,
And more than 10?
yes.
Can you give me a ballpark so I don't have to keep going up in increments here?
Well, I can tell you that this year, which is what my memory serves me on the stand, I have been involved in 3 cases. I will have been involved in 3 cases. They take a lot of my private practice time, so it's difficult for me to do many of these.
Okay. Have you been involved on both as a witness for the prosecution and the defense?
Yes, I have.
And in what kinds of cases were you involved as an expert for the prosecution?
Where I was asked to evaluate child abuse, typically.
My question is, though, what were the charges? Do you recall what kinds of cases? Were they child abuse cases?
They were child abuse cases. The charges were that the child had been abused either by someone outside the home, but more, my clinical experience is more typically, I've been asked to evaluate incest situations, incest cases,
And so you were...
where the abuse occurs within the family.
So you have been an expert for the prosecution in cases involving child abuse. Is that sexual abuse or other kinds of abuse as well?
It's other kinds of abuses as well.
Now, how did you become involved in this particular case? Was it the usual way, someone just, either a court or a litigant just called you up and said, hey, I've heard of you and I want you to work on this case?
Oh, no.
So this was different?
This was very different. I was asked to do this as a member of a consortium, a national consortium, that I contribute my time to.
What's the name of the consortium?
The name of the consortium is the Psychological Maltreatment Consortium.
And what kinds of people belong? Consortium tells me it's a group of people.
It's a group of people. It's a group of 13 professionals. Some are psychologists. Some are attorneys. There are 13, I said that. It was formed in early 1991, late 1990. And it comes from the Office for the Study of Psychological Maltreatment, which is located at Purdue University and at the University of Indianapolis, in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Now, the Office for the Study of Psychological Maltreatment, is that a research organization?
It's the study for the psychological rights of the child. I back up. That's what the name of the consortium is. And we study psychological maltreatment.
Okay, for the psychological rights of the child.
Of the child.
Now, what was the purpose, as you understand it, of putting together this group of 13 professionals into this consortium? What was the consortium's tasks? I mean, how did this consortium, formed from the Office for the Study of the Psychological Rights of the Child, have anything to do with your getting involved in this criminal case?
This consortium was sent a number of cases from various parts in the country to look at and evaluate as a group to see if we thought that psychological maltreatment was likely to have occurred and likely to have had an influence on individuals' lives.
Excuse me, Your Honor. Can we take a break? I need to sit down. I'm just busy. I'm just busy.
Okay. All right, we'll take a recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume at 1:30.
All right, Leslie Abramson got a little dizzy there, so we had a break, and we'll be back.
A few matters before we resume. First of all, you okay?
I'm having busy spells. I don't know why. I was going to ask the court's permission to examine from here.
Of course. And you let me know if you need a break.
I don't know what it is. I don't feel I'm getting sick, but I'm just busy. And I ate. I did everything everybody advised me to do, but it might just be stress and other things that I haven't had time to deal with. So
Or you let me know if you need a break.
I will. Thank you very much.
The jury panel is back, and we're ready to resume. Witness is still on the witness stand. You may continue your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'll remain here.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, we were talking about this national consortium as being the originating agency that you were involved with that got you to be here today testifying in this case. Okay. Now, you testified, I believe, that several case histories were submitted to this group for some purpose?
There were 4 cases submitted to this group with just some facts about the history of the individuals involved.
Okay, my question is, were these 4 case histories or 4 court cases? I mean, how were they presented to the group?
They were presented to the group as 4 case histories.
Family histories.
Family histories.
All right. And did you know who the people were on each of these cases?
No, we did not. It was blind analysis of each of the cases.
So these 4 case histories were submitted for blind analysis by
Correct.
members of the consortium?
That's correct.
Now, did all 13 members consult on all of the cases, or were there subgroups?
There were subgroups.
And were you on the subgroup that was evaluating what turned out to be, as you later learned, the Menendez family?
I was.
And who were the other members of the consortium that were involved in the evaluation of what you later learned was the Menendez family case history?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Now, you had indicated that the members of the consortium, most of them are psychologists.
That's correct.
And are they psychologists specializing in a particular area?
Yes.
And what area are they specialists in?
Child development, child abuse, child maltreatment.
And are they people who have done research and published extensively and lectured extensively?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
Yes, they are.
Are they people recognized as national experts, leading experts in these fields?
They are.
And I believe you indicated that the cases that were sent, the consortium subgroups determined that 2 of these cases did meet the standards and guidelines for psychological maltreatment, child abuse.
Yes, that is correct.
And was this case one of those 2 cases?
This was.
And at some point after this initial evaluation was made, did you learn, you and the other members of the consortium, that this family history had to do with a homicide case involving the Menendez family?
At the second meeting, we learned that it had to do with a homicide case. We still had no identifying data as to name, place, only age of the individuals involved,
Okay.
and sex, age and sex.
And was a decision made at some point that to do an appropriate evaluation and analysis, members of the consortium would have to meet with each of the children of this family as it was presented to you in order to evaluate them in person?
Once it was decided that the case met the criteria, in the opinion of the subgroup of the consortium, yes.
Met the criteria for,
Psychological maltreatment.
okay. And were 2 members of the subgroup of the consortium then determined to be the appropriate people to then come to Los Angeles and meet with Eric and Lyle Menendez and evaluate them in person?
That is correct.
And were you selected by the consortium to do that evaluation for Eric Menendez?
Yes.
And who was selected by the consortium to do the evaluation for Lyle Menendez?
Dr. Stuart Hart.
And who was Dr. Hart in the context of the consortium?
Dr. Stuart Hart is the director of the Office for the Study of the Rights of Psychological Maltreatment.
And we heard from him. We heard from him in a past stream that we just did.
And did you then, subsequent to those decisions, come to Los Angeles and meet with Eric Menendez?
I did.
And have you come and met with him on more than one occasion?
I have.
How many hours have you actually spent talking to and interviewing Eric?
Approximately 30 hours.
Now, in addition to talking to and interviewing Eric, have you reviewed materials in this case?
I have.
And can you just tell us briefly what categories, if you will, of materials you have reviewed?
I've reviewed school records. I've reviewed medical records. I have
Let me slow you down a little bit. Whose
Sorry.
school records?
Eric's school records.
Okay, whose medical records?
Eric's medical records.
Go on.
I have reviewed therapist records.
Is that Mrs. Menendez?
Mrs. Menendez.
And did that include Dr. Summerfield, Dr. Cox, Dr. Emery?
Emery, yes.
Okay, what else?
I have reviewed witness interviews, family,
You mean under witness interviews with family members?
family members,
Who else? Teachers, coaches?
coaches, teachers, more coaches, more teachers,
Lots of coaches and teachers.
Coaches and
Friends,
teachers.
neighbors,
friends, neighbors,
business associates of this.
business associates interviews.
Okay, let me ask you approximately how many hours, this is before the trial began. Did you do the reading that you've just described before the trial began?
I did.
And approximately how many hours, if you will, or pages, if you know it that way, of interviews, notes, and records did you review before the trial even began?
It's a difficult estimate. I have a room that's been consumed by information, thousands of pages.
Now, since the trial began, have you also received copies of the transcripts that the reporters make up of the testimony of numerous witnesses in this case?
Yes, I have.
Have you, first of all, received and read the testimony of one L. Jerome Oziel?
Yes, I have.
Did you also read the testimony of the witnesses called by the defense, family members, coaches, teachers, friends, neighbors, those people?
I have. Yes.
Did you also read the entire testimony of Lyle Menendez?
Yes, I did.
Did you read the entire testimony that you didn't actually hear of Eric Menendez?
Yes, I did.
And in fact, this morning, did you receive some additional information from a place called the Lewis Clinic and School in Princeton, New Jersey?
I did. I had an opportunity to briefly review that.
Now, having arrived at being an expert in this case through this consortium, did you consult with the other consortium members as you were reading and absorbing all this information about the Menendez family and the case?
Yes, I have.
Now, is it your understanding that it's your purpose as an expert to address one aspect of the Menendez family system?
Yes, that is my understanding.
And what aspect of what we'll call the Menendez family system are you to address?
The psychological maltreatment issues.
Now, we have a chart. Your Honor, I'd like to mark this next in order. 295.
All right,
And if I could have the assistance of one of the bailiffs.
sure.
Can you see that, Dr. Tyler?
I can.
Yeah, Dr. Tyler, was the consortium involved at all in refining standards and the guidelines for defining what behaviors inside the family constitute psychological maltreatment?
Yes, we did.
It's easier if you point it directly at you. Right. And what I've done is put up on the board a chart entitled Psychological Maltreatment. What are those 6 things that are listed underneath psychological maltreatment on that chart?
Rejecting,
And
degrading.
I don't mean to read it, but are those categories of some kind?
Yes, there is an operational definition of psychological maltreatment. These are the 6 categories that are define what psychological maltreatment is.
Are these categories of behavior by caregivers or parents towards children?
Psychological maltreatment is essentially a repeated pattern of behaviors
By big people towards little
by caretakers or others, by adults, by people
towards
towards children that the behaviors convey a message to that individual that somehow they are flawed, they are not worthy, there's something wrong with them. They are there only to meet the needs of the individual who is doing the behavior.
For simplicity's sake, given the participants in this particular family, instead of using individual, could we talk about the person who is doing the maltreating as the parents and the people who are receiving it as the children?
Yes, we could.
Okay.
I will.
In this particular case history, in your opinion, were the parents, Jose and Mary Louise Menendez, psychologically abusive towards the children, Joseph Lyle and Eric Menendez?
Yes, that is my belief. That is my opinion.
Now, these 6 categories, are these categories of behaviors by the parents?
They are.
And do each of these categories convey a particular message to a child who is the recipient of such behaviors?
Yes.
And is the message a message about the parent or a message about the child or both?
It's a message about both.
Okay. And for example, why don't we start with the first one? The first category is what?
Rejecting, degrading.
Rather than talk about the Menendez family for a moment, could you give us just a simple example of parental rejecting, degrading behavior? Just an example.
I wish you were never born. You're stupid.
Okay. Now, we're talking about.
We know that Mrs. Menendez said that to Lyle all the time, that she regretted having him or that he ruined her life. And yeah, I I mean, how much more degrading can you get than your own parent telling you she never wanted you and you ruined her life? I mean, that's awful.
Strike that. Psychological maltreatment is a type of child abuse.
Yes, it is.
And you, based on your background as a psychologist involved in child abuse, in the earlier part of your career, did you focus more on physical abuse and then sexual abuse of children as forms of child abuse?
Yes, I did.
And is there now some interest and research and a lot of literature being generated about this kind of child abuse, psychological maltreatment?
Yes, psychological maltreatment is considered to be the core issue in almost all abuse.
And why is that?
Because it gives the child a message about who they are. It has to do with their sense of self, their sense of worth.
Okay, well, let's say you smack your child and say you slap him to the ground. That gives him a message, doesn't it?
Yes.
And what's the message that you get from that kind of physical abuse?
Well, there could be a variety of messages. I think the important thing is that maltreatment is not an isolated issue. It's a repeated pattern.
But my point is, when you physically abuse a child, does
Yes.
the child get a psychological message?
Yes.
That he's worthless, that he isn't loved, that kind of thing?
That he's not okay, or that his action is not okay, his behavior is not okay.
Okay. Can you do the same thing to a child with just words and other behaviors that you can do to them by punching them or hitting them?
Oh, yes.
And is it the punch in physical abuse that causes the long-term damage to children, or is it the message?
It's the message. Bones heal. Minds do not often.
All right. Now, every parent, wouldn't you agree, has at some time in those long and terrible years said something negative to their child, called them stupid, called them dummy, said, I hope you have six like you, or I wish you weren't born. I mean, nobody's perfect. Is that
I
right?
think we all have, as parents. There isn't a perfect parent.
Okay. Now, if you were to take a knife and stab your child through the stomach once and never do another thing to them, that would still be a serious traumatic episode, wouldn't
Oh,
it?
yes.
If you were to once call your child stupid or dummy or jerk, would that be a serious event?
Isolated, you only did it once, wasn't built on any other
Right.
maltreatment. Is it serious? Probably not, if it's one incident.
Children are somewhat resilient.
Yes, children are.
Life is full of slings and arrows. We can get over some
Correct.
insults, can't we? What then makes calling a child stupid or dummy or wishing they were never born, just as verbal negatives, what makes that a form of child abuse rather than just bad manners on the part of a parent?
Well, it sends over a period of time, if the pattern is repeated, it conveys to the child, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy, that if you tell me enough times that I'm stupid, I'm going to believe that I am and that I cannot do anything about it, that I am maybe helpless in my stupidity.
Does it therefore affect the way a child develops if you give them these negative messages?
That is the important part of psychological maltreatment of children, is it does impact their emotional development, their mental development, and their development of being able to relate interpersonally to the world that they know.
So it affects how they feel about themselves.
Yes.
It affects their abilities to perform in life.
Yes.
And it affects their ability to have decent relationships with other people.
It does. It affects their ability to perform in school. And this is all supported by research.
Now, we've just been talking about this first category, rejecting, degrading. I guess the simplest examples are name-calling type behaviors. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, moving on to terrorizing, which includes endangering. What is just, again, not necessarily from this case, but what is a simple example of terrorizing behavior of a child by a parent?
Locking a child in a closet that's dark with no light and no way to get out.
Okay.
Well, we know that Eric got locked up in his room and wasn't allowed to come out certain times, and oftentimes without dinner.
And what does those kinds of behaviors that are terrorizing, what message does that give the child?
Well, when a child is terrorized, they develop an incredible fear. And if a child is terrorized enough, they become fearful of many, many things. And often fear then leads into extreme anxiety, anxious behavior.
Okay.
It's hard to think when you're fearful, when you're anxious.
What's it like to be a person who's chronically fearful or chronically anxious? What does it feel like to be that person?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
Yeah, I mean, based on the research and the study of particularly of children, and there is recent research, isn't there, about how children think and how children feel and finding ways to communicate with children to find these things out.
Yes.
So what does it feel like? I mean, does a person who's fearful and anxious suffer?
Yes, they suffer. If you're terrorized, and the terror is severe enough, you feel that your life is threatened. that you may not live through this being locked in the closet.
Okay. Now, one episode of locking in the closet would not be nice, but would that necessarily result in a child who is chronically fearful or anxious or terrorized or afraid of dying?
Something like that, if they're left for any period of time, could really set quite a good basis for that child, for additional terrorization. So again, I talk about the cumulative effect, the repeated pattern.
In order for you or the other members of the consortium or for any reasonable researcher or clinician in the field to come up with a evaluation of psychological maltreatment, must there be evidence of persistent or chronic or repeated episodes of coming in any of these 6 categories? I mean, does it require that before you would ever say that a case history indicated psychological
Yes, that's the definition of psychological maltreatment. It is a repeated pattern of behaviors.
It isn't just one of these and one of those.
No, it's not one of these and one of those, and it's over a period of time. And there have to be observable consequences, observable effects at school, at home, with peers, with...
You mean effects that show up in the behavior of the child?
In the behavior, in the way the child perceives his world, he thinks, in the child's feelings, in the way the child performs at school, across the board.
So even if you had information that the parents in a particular family or a parent was calling names, was terrorizing, and we'll get to the other ones too, was doing these things, unless you saw some evidence of the effect on the child, would you withhold the determination that there had been psychological maltreatment?
Depends on when we're asked to make the determination.
What do you mean by that?
Sometimes, as a psychologist, you are asked to evaluate a child where perhaps a teacher has noticed that the parent or the caretaker has been unusually harsh with the child or is treating the child in a way that the teacher, on the basis of her experience, would predict that there would be some consequences for this child. Now, if I'm asked to do that, to evaluate a child in that setting, hopefully I don't have to wait until there are some very serious consequences, which is the reason that we get into the family too.
Yeah, but I don't actually understand that. I mean, I realize this isn't my best day, but here's what I want to know, okay? Children, I mean, everybody's slightly different than everybody else. Is that a given? Psychologically, slightly different.
That's the one generalization we can make about people is they're all different. Yes.
And inside a family, some children are just innately more sensitive than others from birth, aren't they?
Children are born with different temperaments, that is correct.
And different sensitivities.
And different sensitivities.
So you could have 2 children in a family, say, where a mother routinely calls one stupid and dummy and idiot, and it just, you never see any effect on that child. They don't report bad feelings or sad feelings. That doesn't seem to influence their behavior. It doesn't seem to influence their school performance. You just can't find any effects. And another child in the family where the mother does the same thing, and that child is withdrawn and has school problems and is sad and is frightened and all these other things.
Objection, leading.
Yes, and it's also a little unintelligible. Why don't you break it down and
Thank you.
lead the witness? Although she's an expert and you are permitted to do so, it's best to have her testify rather than...
My point is, do you just look at one half of the equation, the parental treatment, or do you look at both halves before you determine whether behavior does rise to psychological maltreatment?
We look at both halves.
Now let's go down to isolating, okay? What is the significance of isolating as a form of psychological maltreatment?
This is probably one of the consequences of isolating an individual. Probably has the most severe effects.
Okay. Why is that?
That's because if a child is maltreated and then you isolate that child from any outside help, any outside intervention, then basically you are saying to that child or placing that child in a situation where he's hopeless, he's helpless. There is no way, if a child or a system is isolated, that the individual can see that there's a way to survive, a way to get out. Does that make sense to you?
Well, let's ask another question.
It's not whether it makes sense to me.
Questions will be asked by counsel.
Right. Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, let me... I think you've indicated that when a child is abused, they suffer. Is that right?
I've indicated that, yes.
Now, you had talked about earlier the fact that you helped to establish through your grant writing this crisis intervention nursery.
That's correct.
Where certain support was brought to abused children and their families.
That's correct.
When you talk about isolating as a form of maltreatment, do you mean physically keeping a child locked inside a room or in a house far away in the woods where no one else can ever see what's going on? I mean, what does isolating mean?
Well, isolating means the things that you've just talked about. It also means, perhaps more importantly, you isolate the individual from having relationships that with other people. You isolate the intimate relationships. You isolate the individual by For instance, in incest families, we see extreme isolation because the family is enmeshed and it is bound by secrecy. Therefore, that individual within that family is isolated.
And therefore, is a child who is isolated in a family where there's maltreatment likely to reach out and get help?
No, that child is not likely to reach out and get help.
Now, the next category you have is exploiting, corrupting. And what are some examples generally of exploiting, corrupting behavior that constitute psychological maltreatment?
Well, as you know, abuse of any kind operates on a continuum. And when you look from a smack on the thumb to a severe beating, from one incident to a lifetime of incidents, in exploiting and corrupting, at one end of the continuum, it would be maybe insisting that your child go into a particular career for a period of time, or participate in a particular sport for a short period of time. Using the child to meet your own needs. That's what exploiting means. Then that definition also includes missocializing, and that means giving messages to the child about simple messages like cheating, honesty. If the message you give a child is that it's okay to cheat to get to this goal, then you are missocializing the child. You are giving them the message that it's okay to cheat.
And that's corrupting, is it?
No, well, yes, it is. Corrupting is, we see it sort of at this end of the continuum where children are used for the purposes of the adult in very serious ways, such as children who are used in pornography rings, children who are sexually exploited, children who are sold into prostitution, children who are repeatedly used by the perpetrator.
Okay, now you mentioned when you first started this description of exploiting, corrupting, you said basically it's a category where an adult is using a child to meet the adult's needs.
That's correct.
All right. You also gave as examples choosing a sport or choosing a career. Is there something wrong with that?
There's something wrong with it if it is something that the child has no choice about.
And I think you said that's the mildest end of the spectrum, like a parent telling a kid they've got to play soccer or they've got to play baseball because the parent always wanted to be a baseball star or a soccer star.
Or having a little girl go into modeling because the mother always wanted to be a model, and so she has a 3-year-old being photographed and that kind of thing. And that can be an exploitive experience for a child. Yes.
Does the child experience it as exploitation? I mean, does the child know they're being exploited, or do they know they're being forced? I mean, is there a message there?
It depends upon the developmental age, and we look at all of these definitions of psychological maltreatment within a developmental context.
What do you mean by whose developmental age?
The child's developmental age.
And could you just give us quickly, what are the significant developmental age brackets?
Yes, 0 to 2.
Okay, and what's the next one?
And 2 to 6.
And the next?
6 to 11.
Okay.
Then we go 13 to 18. 12 is sort of on the cusp.
Okay. And those are significant developmental ages for all children?
Yes, and then 18 to 24, if you want to take it up into young adulthood.
Okay. Now, are you saying that various kinds of behaviors in these categories are more or less severe depending on the developmental age of the child?
That is correct.
Okay. So what do we mean then with respect to, we were talking about exploiting and corrupting. You said whether or not a particular behavior will cause a message to the child depends on the developmental age.
Within each of those developmental ages that I have identified, the 0 to 2, the 2 to 6, so forth, there are developmental tasks that each one of us had to go through as children. Some make it through more easily than others, depending upon the temperament of the child. But the research shows, and this is old and continuing research, that children have certain periods of development. And those tasks, for instance, the 0 to 2 child, the task of development there is attachment to the caretaker. In our culture, it's typically the mom and the dad.
Okay.
And the task is attachment.
Because Kitty was never really parenting very well or attentively, do we know who actually was watching the kids? Or were they just running amok around the house and doing whatever they wanted? That's what I wonder. Was there a nanny that maybe was supposed to watch them when they were younger, like little? If anybody knows, I'd be interested to know because she didn't really care to spend time with them. So is it possible that, she had somebody else raise them when they were really young? I don't know. Something. look into?
And trust. That's if I'm attached to my mom, my dad, I have the beginnings of what we call basic trust.
So how do these things impact? Let's say we take someone who's in that early stage when attachment is the key, okay?
Yes.
Are there things on that list that would impact even a 0 to 2-year-old?
Yes,
My question was...
there are.
All right. And what are the things that would give a message even to an infant that would give them one of these negative messages?
An infant when I cry, I need to be picked up, I need to be held. When I'm scared, I need somebody to hold me and reassure me.
So
those kinds of things.
All right, let me ask you a question. If you terrorize an infant, okay, does that send a message even to the nonverbal brain of an infant, a negative message?
Absolutely.
And if an infant receives these kinds of negative messages, does it interfere with his developmental task of forming attachment and trust?
Yes, it does. If you're unable to form a trust relationship in the beginning years of life, I've seen children who play catch-up for many years afterwards. It's a very basic thing. If we don't trust, we don't have anything.
Let's go back to exploiting and corrupting, okay? Let's go back to some of the behaviors that you said constituted exploiting or corrupting. Is there a particular developmental age when exploiting, corrupting maltreatment sends the most powerful message or interferes the most with developmental tasks?
All of these definitions impact every developmental level, and how it impacts the level is dependent really upon the task of the level. In other words, and if the child from 0 to 2 doesn't trust anybody, and then they hit 2 to 6, where the task is really becoming more independent from mom and dad, daring to be more independent, to explore, to move away. And if the child does not trust that they can get the caretaking that they need from mom and dad, they're going to be very reluctant to do that exploring. Because sometimes there's no attachment, but often with children we see what we call an anxious attachment, a clinging behavior, because the child is so mistrustful.
When you see the clinging behavior, let's say in a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, does that give you some reason to believe that there was problems in the attachment stage and now there's problems in this go explore stage?
Yes.
Let's go to the denying emotional needs category. Can you give us some simple example of what kinds of parental behavior constitutes denying a child's emotional needs?
I smile at you and you don't smile back. You don't acknowledge that I have feelings, that I'm trying to connect with you in a nonverbal way. I cry, you don't pick me up. I have a nightmare and you ignore it, or you treat it in a way that either minimizes it and tells me that I'm not important, or maybe there's something wrong, or maybe I don't exist. Maybe there's not a me inside because I'm not getting the feedback from my environment that I need to know that I'm a person.
Okay. And if a child is frightened and a parent is critical of fear, is that meeting the child's emotional needs or denying them, or what?
Well, it's actually two forms of abuse. It's not responding to the child's need to be comforted, but it's also ridiculing it, it's degrading it, and it's saying it's not okay to be scared.
And does that kind of behavior, when a parent ridicules fear or refuses to acknowledge it or treats it, well, you'll get over it, you've got to be tough, does that make the child less fearful because they're being told, don't be afraid, just do it? Does that make a child less fearful?
No, of course it doesn't. It only serves to make them more fearful because they never resolve.
They never resolve what?
And then they're afraid that they're going to make their parents mad because they're still afraid. So more issues on top of it.
They never resolve what it was they were frightened of, and they think that maybe if it's laughed at, sometimes children are even afraid to say what they're afraid of, because the last time they told dad or mom or grandma that they were scared, and the response was, well, you're stupid, there's nothing to be afraid of, or you need to be brave, you need to not be afraid, you need to be strong. And the message that a child gets is, there's something wrong with me because I'm scared.
And then they would tend to, you think, hide other fears?
Oh, yes. And begin to maybe hide other feelings and begin to stuff all this inside.
And is it unhealthy for a child not to be able to express their fears and have them resolved, as you mentioned?
It impedes their growth, their normal development, their ability to be happy.
Let's move on for a moment to denying mental, educational, or medical needs. Is that something that used to be called neglect?
Yes.
And neglect has long been recognized as a form of child abuse, is it not?
Yes. Neglect, also incorporates the denying emotional needs.
Also, there's another category that isn't here, isn't there? There's denying physical needs. I mean, if you starve them, I guess you're maltreating them in a major way.
Objection, leading.
Yeah. Is there another category of, is there a psychological maltreatment component to physical neglect of children? In other words, if you don't feed them on time, if you don't clothe them adequately, if you don't keep them in a nice, warm, clean place, is that just physical maltreatment, or is there a psychological component?
Well, there's a psychological component, and I think that would probably include all of those. If you're not meeting basic needs of a child with a baby, they depend on us for their life. They depend on us to bathe them and to feed them and to provide a place for them to sleep. If we can recognize that they're sick, to get some medical help for them. Okay. So that really, that babies need to be held, that babies need to have play with other people.
Is that part of denying emotional needs and denying mental, educational, or medical needs?
Yes, and I think it's also rejecting if you're not able to meet a child's needs, very basic needs. If you look at what those basic needs are, the very first few months of life, they're physical needs. They're the needs to be fed and to be burped and to be diapered and then the emotional needs.
Do little babies need to be responded to? If they smile at you and you, or if they smile or if they cry and if you don't respond to them, does something happen to them, or can something happen to them?
Well, they can die. And after the Second World War, when children in England were put into orphanages, and even though the orphanage could provide the basic physical needs of these kids, and they were not being terrorized. Of course, they'd been terrorized by the war, but there weren't enough caretakers, primarily there were nuns that were doing the caretaking, to really be able to comfort these children and to touch them and to hold them, and some of them died, and there was no physical reason.
Just for lack of emotional responsiveness?
Yes.
Now, you were talking about the developmental issues at different ages, and I'd like to turn to that. Let's start with that fundamental developmental age you talked about, 0 to 2, and what a child needs at that age.
The child needs to have their physical needs taken care of. The child needs to have their safety needs taken care of. The child has to have love and a sense of belonging.
And you said the key issue at this age, 0 to 2, is something that you called attachment.
Yes.
Now, what is attachment in the sense that you're using it?
Attachment in this way I'm using it is a child being connected with a primary caregiver, a mom, a dad, a grandma, a foster mother, somebody that the child feels protected by, and somebody the child can trust. That's it.
Now, has there been extensive research on this need of the human organism to form this early life attachment?
Oh, yes. The attachment literature is very extensive.
And if a child is not...
And it's like across all species that the children of the mother animal or human always bonds with the baby. The baby and the mother always bond, very early on. So it's not just a human thing. This is across pretty much every species on Earth.
not have this in their early years, if they do not form this attachment, has there been research that shows very severe consequences for later life?
Yes.
And what kinds of consequences for later life occur when there's a failure for... Well, I think you talked about those babies in World War II. They died?
Some die.
And what are some of the other problems that occur when a child does not have this trusting attachment?
Well, if you can't trust that you'll be taken care of, you can't trust on very much.
And what happens if you move on through life without being able to trust anything? I take it trust with respect to other people.
That's correct.
What happens if you can't trust people?
You're isolated.
Your Honor, could we have a brief break?
We'll resume at 3 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Let's make 3:05.
You testified earlier that your opinion was that this was a family system in which the children were psychologically maltreated by the parents. Is
That's
that correct?
correct.
And with respect to Eric Menendez, did you find psychological maltreatment by both parents in every category listed on that chart?
Yes, I did.
Now, in formulating that opinion, was it necessary for you to evaluate this family system?
Yes, it was.
And in doing that, did you look at the different roles, that each member of this four-person system played within the family?
Yes, I did.
And in evaluating that, did you look to see who had the power in this family?
I did. I evaluated that.
And what was your evaluation on that issue?
Well, the parents both had the power, and while it would seem to the outside world that the father, Jose, was the most powerful, in fact, on examination, the mother was a very powerful figure in her own right. As a matter of fact, I would say that she had perhaps more power in some sense than Jose, in that she was with the children the most in the home setting, particularly in the early years. And so she had her own power as the mother, and then she also had power using Jose, who was not present, but the image of Jose as the all-powerful father, as kind of her batterer. She would threaten the children with the father's power. So she had her own, and then she also had her own plus.
Yeah, wait till I tell your father you're not respecting me or you're acting out. I'm gonna tell him as soon as he gets home and you're gonna get spankings or whatever.
The fathers.
Now, you're aware that there's been testimony from some witnesses that, at least on appearances, Mrs. Menendez appeared to be dominated and controlled by Mr. Menendez. You're familiar with that testimony?
Yes, I am.
And there's also some evidence presented by both of the children, both Eric and Lyle Menendez, that there was physical abuse of Mrs. Menendez by Mr. Menendez. And you're familiar with that evidence?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, are you familiar with the literature and with treating battered wives?
I am.
And based on your experience in this field and your evaluation of all the materials in this case, did Mary Louise Menendez fit the typical pattern of a battered wife?
She did not.
And in that context,
She did not. So there's our answer to that. She did not fit that typical battered wife type of stereotype, I guess. She had her own patterns of ABUSE against the kids that would make her not a battered spouse.
did she fit the typical pattern of a powerless victim in this family?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained. It's also argumentative and unfocused.
Well, may
Rephrase
we
the question.
approach-
No, rephrase the question.
All right. Were there behaviors on Kitty Menendez's part that were atypical for battered wives or wives who are totally dominated, controlled, and victimized by their husbands?
Yes, there
Lack
were.
of foundation.
Objection sustained. The answer is straight.
Your Honor, I don't understand the objection.
All right, why don't you approach?
Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Tyler, you've indicated that you examined the materials concerning how Mrs. Menendez treated Eric when Mr. Menendez was not around. Is that
That's correct.
And in that respect, did you determine what her influence was from a psychological maltreatment standpoint on her son?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
I think it was apparent that Kitty Menendez was able to effectively isolate Eric, not only from his brother within the family, but from people outside of the family. She was able to terrorize him. She would lose him at shopping malls when he was a little boy, and when the security guard would call and ask to have him picked up, the reports are that she would finish her shopping and then go pick up the child.
Now, what aspects of psychological maltreatment does that particular repeated behavior demonstrate to you?
I think it addresses the rejecting. I think it addresses the denying emotional needs. And I think it's terrorizing. It's terrorizing for a child to be lost in a mall and not have anybody know where he is.
In going over all of the material in this case, did you find behaviors by Mrs. Menendez at every developmental age that fell into the category of rejecting and degrading behavior towards Eric?
Yes, I did. I did a very thorough analysis of each developmental level and pulled out incidents that would fall under each definition of psychological maltreatment. And without exception, every developmental level included each form of maltreatment, starting with age 0, when, in fact, it was disclosed that Mrs. Menendez had not wanted to have children at all.
And that would be every category of psychological maltreatment at every developmental age by Mrs. Menendez.
That is correct.
Now, did you also, in analyzing the family system here, assess the impact of Mr. Menendez from a psychological maltreatment standpoint?
I did.
And were there certain categories of psychological maltreatment that were more typically engaged in by Mr. Menendez than others? At least that you had more data about.
I had data about every category. Primarily, the data about Mr. Menendez had to do with terrorizing, exploiting, corrupting, and most certainly isolation. That seemed to be probably the most pervasive form of psychological maltreatment in this family. Isolation within the family, isolation from people outside the family.
When you say isolation within the family, what do you mean?
Well, an example would be when Eric would cry and his father could not stand a display of emotion. And this is corroborated by many interviews. His message to Eric was, do not tell your mother, because she is my friend.
So that's an effort by Mr. Menendez to keep Eric isolated
To keep Eric isolated from telling his mother when he was hurt or if he needed something.
You recall Eric's testimony that his father said to him at some point that your mother's not your friend, she's mine,
That's
therefore don't
correct.
bother telling her anything bad that I
That's
do to you.
correct.
And do you see that as a purposeful behavior by Mr. Menendez?
Yes, purposeful, intentional. It was a way in which he was able to dominate, control this child.
And do you see other examples in the family of efforts to keep the members of the family separated, non-allied with each other?
Yes, when the children were small, there was a approximately 3-year difference in age. The little boys were purposefully pitted against one another in competition and competing with each other, fighting to really hurt each other, not to be little brothers and to fisticuff and to wrestle, but to hurt each other.
And that has the effect
And that
of what?
separated, that isolated then Eric from his older brother Lyle. Later in years, their developmental years, Eric and Lyle came together more and were able to form more of an alliance. But in the early years, they were pitted against one another competitively, and it appeared as if Eric was pretty much not only the little brother, and all little brothers have a harder time, I think, than big brothers by birth order problems, but he was regarded in the Menendez family as the second-class citizen. He could never please. He couldn't please his father, certainly, because he wasn't as strong. He wasn't as didn't perform as well in sports. And he could never please his mother. I'm not sure he ever gave up trying to please his mother, but there were some very significant incidents as a little guy where he tried to bake a cake once and for her, and I think he was 6 or 7, and his mother came home and something had happened to the oven or to the cake, I'm not sure what, but it was a disaster. And the mother's response was she flew into a rage and was furious with him. And it was a very devastating event for this child. Doesn't sound devastating to us as adults, but it was very devastating to this child because it was, again, a real conscious effort on the part of the child to please his mother in a way that appeared to be impossible throughout the years.
Let me get back to, though, we were talking about Mr. Menendez. You have indicated some examples of how he did things or said things to keep Eric isolated. Did it appear from everything that you've read that Mr. Menendez subscribed to the notion divide and conquer?
Sergeant calls for speculation.
With respect to how he managed the family, did you see conscious efforts to keep everybody separated from everybody else except him?
Yes, it was very obvious within the family the way he was able to achieve that. Also, Mrs. Menendez was able to achieve that in her own way. And if we're talking just about Mr. Menendez, he had intimidated, and it appears from reviewing all the interviews that I've gone over, it appears that he intimidated teachers and certainly the coaches and friends, business associates, but he also intimidated his own family, his own sisters, such that the children had no one else to turn to but to their mother or their father. They were isolated from any outside resources.
Now, you were talking before about how they were isolated within the family by such messages as your mother's not your friend, she's mine. And this, what you're talking about now, is a notion of isolation from people outside the family. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any significance that you attach to the sort of mythologizing that appears to have gone on in this family? The kinds of things like, Menendezes are superior and the fathers talk about his prowess in business. Does that have any significance on this issue of isolation?
Objection vague.
Rephrase the question.
Are you familiar with the reports, the interviews, and the testimony that Mr. Menendez would regale his sons with stories of his ruthless business dealings and his powerful connections and his notions of superiority?
I am.
Are you familiar with the testimony by him and others in interviews where he talks about the greatness of his family, their great achievements, their connections to the Romans, and other such myth-making?
Yes, I am.
And what significance, if any, does that behavior and practice on his part have?
It has tremendous significance because, in effect, what it's saying to the children is, I am omniscient, I know everything, I am all-powerful, no one dares cross me. And Eric was able to see that happen within his family and outside of his family. No one dared cross. When people tried to intervene on his behalf, meaning a teacher or a coach or his aunt, they were severely chastised. They were told, this is not your business. you stay away. And they stayed away.
And based on that, and based on your contacts with Eric and your evaluation of him, in your opinion, did he believe in his father's power and omniscience and ability to control and intimidate other people?
Objection. Improper opinion.
Sustained. Your next question.
Would a child in such an environment, with that kind of parental message repeated, have any reason to doubt that message?
No, he would not.
And did you find support in the materials that you reviewed that Mrs. Menendez subscribed to a similar theory of familial superiority and exclusivity?
Objection, Wiggin.
Overruled.
Mrs. Menendez was reportedly, and again, this is by reviewing interviews from a variety of witnesses. She ask the question again, please.
Okay. The question is whether you saw in those materials that Mrs. Menendez also promoted a myth of the superior exclusive family that had an isolating effect on the children.
She was primarily, according to the reports, interested in the image of the family, in her image as Kitty Menendez. And this was borne out by testimony from a variety of sources. She was said to have been interested in her child only in that his performance would serve her needs.
And what need of hers would his, I take it, positive performance or winning performance, what need of hers did that serve?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
When you have a parent whose interest in a child is to fulfill their own needs, what is the effect on the child?
The child's sense of self is badly damaged. The child feels they don't have a life. They don't deserve to have needs, to deserve to have feelings, to be able to think on their own, to be able to make choices. Eric Menendez, according to everything that I could read about his early childhood, was not even allowed to choose what he ate, what he wore, what happened to his body. He wasn't able to close his eyes and rest and be left alone.
And when that is a pattern through a child's life, when they reach adolescence, are they prepared to problem solve and make choices and go through the separation that's necessary at adolescence in a healthy way?
Absolutely not. As I indicated at the beginning of my testimony, child development here is critical. And when a child does not pass through the developmental stages having their needs met and along the way, then we cannot expect them to achieve young adolescence, young adulthood, with the ability to have self-confidence, to make choices. It creates, with a child like Eric, it created a terrible double bind because he was forced, consciously and unconsciously, to be extremely dependent upon his mother and his father, extremely dependent, so that when he reached the age of, well, that age 2, when the task is to develop autonomy, meaning a toddler who starts learning about being independent, all the way up to the teenage years, when the teenager is really needing to test their independence, and all teenagers do, this child had never really mastered that 2-year-old task of knowing that he could be independent. He didn't have the skills. He didn't have the skills really mentally, and that wasn't because there was anything wrong with his brain. He was tested to be a bright child, but he didn't have those skills to problem solve. He didn't have the emotional skills. He was a very young, immature, naive. He was described by...
When you're describing him now, you're describing him at what age?
Well, I'm describing him at... he was young, immature, and at every level. If you were to take him at 6, you would find teacher reports, or at 12, or at 15.
Or at 18?
Or at 18, you would find corroboration all along the way that this was a child who developmentally was not where he should be chronologically, through no fault of his own. So emotionally and mentally, psychologically, he had been cut numerous times. I often use the analogy of when a person is gashed, say on the arm, 1 gash, you can put a Band-Aid on or mercurochrome on. 2 gashes, maybe not still very significant, but if you continue to gash that arm and you never treat, and you never pay any attention to it, and you never put salve on it, what happens? It festers, becomes infected. Sometimes it dies.
All right, but he didn't die. What you're telling us, though, is that he was emotionally, mentally, and psychologically developmentally not where he should have been at every age, including, I take it, the age of 18.
That is correct.
And so was he in a position then at the age of 18 to solve problems, to deal with crisis, to deal with his own emotions the way a healthy, well-developed 18-year-old would have been?
Objection calls for speculation and compound.
In part or in whole, on information concerning her own family, her parents, and what happened in that family, and what that family was like.
I did in part, yes.
Now, is it important in assessing a family to evaluate it for maltreatment, whether it's psychological or sexual or physical, to know the intergenerational history of that family?
Absolutely.
Why is what happened in the preceding generation or generations important or significant in evaluating a family?
Because this we know for a fact that abuse is generational. It is passed from generation to generation, and without some sort of intervention, some sort of outside intervention, it typically passes to the next generation. And
Now-
that is borne out in the research.
Now, in your assessment and evaluation of Eric Menendez and this family, did you seek corroboration from sources apart from Eric and his brother in order to verify that what you were being told about what happened in this family, in fact, happened?
I did, with every incident, corroborate through the other witnesses, review of the other witnesses, the medical records, et cetera, et cetera.
Is the fact that there was abuse in the previous generation also corroborative that a parent would either actively engage in abusive behavior or tolerate it in their home?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Your Honor, I'd like to be heard.
All right, we'll come on to something else, and we'll get it a little later on.
Are you aware from the information that you received that there were behaviors that were visited upon Kitty Menendez that she then visited upon
Counsel,
her own
let's get
children?
on to this a little later on. Go on to something else.
Now, you did an evaluation of the maltreatment that was visited upon Eric by developmental age and by each parent. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I think you said that the main components of the psychological abuse that he experienced was isolating and terrorizing.
Yes, he experienced all of them, but I think the ones that were the most striking in terms of his development were the isolating and the terrorizing. And subsumed underneath that isolation were some of these other things.
And are you familiar with the statements of witnesses and the testimony of witnesses that from a very young age on, Eric demonstrated evidence of being anxious, fearful, withdrawn, lonely, sad, emotional, all of those things?
Low self-esteem.
You're familiar with all that material?
Oh, yes.
Is that consistent with a child who's been visited by maltreatment, focusing on terrorizing and isolating?
Yes, there's very statistically significant correlates of a child who has been terrorized and isolated.
Demonstrating those kinds of personalities and behaviors?
Yes.
Now, turning to your assessment of the actual psychological maltreatment that was inflicted by these parents in Eric's childhood, why don't we try to do this by developmental age and by parent, okay?
Okay.
And with respect to the earliest period, what I propose to do, Dr. Tyler, if you're prepared to do it, is to start with Mrs. Menendez. Now, was there evidence that you discerned, both from evidence in the case and from other materials that you relied on, that there was psychological abuse by the mother between the ages of 0 and 2?
Yes, there was.
And what was the first category of such abuse that you documented?
When Eric was born, under denying emotional needs, Mrs. Menendez had not wanted children. She had expressed that to more than one source. And when she was pregnant with Eric, she had expressed the desire to have a girl and had prepared for this child with buying pink things, and she wanted a little girl.
Well, how is that maltreatment of Eric since he's not born yet?
Well, it sets the unborn child up to be a disappointment, sets him up for perhaps some expectations that can never be met, sets him up for rejection.
And what other information do you have that demonstrates that Mrs. Menendez denied his emotional needs?
Well, I looked at a lot of photographs when he was a baby, and again, I talked, or I didn't talk to, but I reviewed some of the reports from the family, and this was a child who...
But what did you see in the photographs?
Well, in the photographs, this was a child who appeared to be sort of handled like a piece of baggage. I couldn't find any pictures of the mother and the child with any cuddling, any real close. It just stood out. I think that was remarkable for me anyway. And the mother was not noted by people who knew her, from a variety of sources, to be an affectionate person. There was no hugging, no caressing, no terms of endearment, no calling Eric honey, those kinds of things, which seem rather simple, but again, it sets the stage, I think, for the cumulative effect of a child who had no opportunity to really attach.
Do you recall the testimony of Mrs. Baralt, I believe it was, who indicated that she saw no active nurturance by Kitty Menendez towards either of her children?
Yes, I did.
And what happens to a child that does not get... we've been talking about the negatives, but let me ask you this, Dr. Tyler. Over the entire course of his life, based on all the information that you evaluated, all the incidents that you looked at, and let me ask you a question here. Do you know about, have you read about, and have you interviewed about far more incidents than were actually testified to in this trial?
Yes.
Over the course of all of what you've read, did you find any evidence of affection, nurturance, demonstrations or expressions of love, regard, support, or positivity by Mrs. Menendez towards Eric?
I did not. Not one report.
And this began in this age 0 to 2, no positive signs of nurturance, affection, or love?
There were a couple of incidents that I pulled from the child's history. Not only did his mother appear to be not available to him in an emotional way.
Is not available a term that means not demonstrating positive
not demonstrating positive emotion, not being there with him emotionally, not connecting. Eric was reported by his aunt that he, as a toddler, I believe before the age he was 18 months, he would leave the house on a very regular basis before his mother was up, and he would cross the street and go to a relative's home, and oftentimes his diaper would be down around his ankles, and his aunt would then call and notify the parent that the child was at their house and mother had not yet missed him. Again, sounds trivial, but a very important message when you're 18 months old.
Is it trivial if when you're 18 months old, in order to get to your aunt's house, you have to cross a public street?
No, that is not trivial. That's really not providing safety for the child.
But what does that mean with respect to denying? How is that an example of denying an emotional need? I mean, is this child being mischievous? Is he being naughty? Is he running away from home? I mean,
no, he's just probably waking up and wanting to connect with somebody that's going to change his diaper and give him something to eat. So
Move to strike that answer as being speculative.
Sustain the answer straight.
Well, do you have an opinion based on your understanding of what children under the age of 2 need from their physical environment, particularly when they first get up in the morning, from which you can base why it is this child would go out in the cold, morning after morning, seeking someone else's home?
Objection calls for improper opinion.
Sustain to the form of the question.
Let me turn the question around. You're aware that Mrs. Barral testified this happened about 20 times?
yes,
Now, if a child at that age is allowed to leave the home day after day, 20 times, would that constitute a mother who is not perhaps paying attention
that constitutes neglect.
and is later on driving recklessly in a car with a 2-year-old who has no seatbelt or safety belt so that he can swing freely from a strap? Is that neglect?
That is neglect.
Is
Also
that,
could be terrorization.
does it endanger the life and safety of a child to allow those behaviors?
Yes,
Is that a sign of love?
it's a sign of neglect. Terrorization. Disinterest.
Does a child disinterest, is that related to denying emotional needs?
Yes.
And how does the child experience motherly disinterest?
How does a child experience motherly disinterest?
Yeah, if a mother is disinterested, and what does that do to the child?
Well, the message is, you don't count. The message is, I don't like you, I don't love you. I'm bothered by you.
Are you familiar with the testimony of Mrs. Baralt and her statements that at one point Mrs. Menendez left Eric behind when she went off to look for a new house?
Yes.
And
Yeah, I am.
and what's the significant part of that particular anecdotal information?
Eric was still a very little boy. He was still a baby meaning under the age of 2. And he was left for 3 weeks with Mrs. Baralt. The mother called, as I understand Mrs. Baralt's testimony, very seldom, and the baby was just inconsolable. He was He didn't understand. He couldn't be comforted.
Let me ask you something. If the information that you've been relying on, that Mrs. Menendez was not nurturing, was not loving, was not comforting of Eric when he was under 2, why would he miss her when she's gone?
Because that was the only mother that he knew, and his attachment was a very anxious attachment.
What does that mean?
And he was codependent, which we know. So, yeah, he's going to miss the person that did everything for him.
Yeah, he couldn't predict if and when she would be there for him. And this goes back to the attachment literature. This was a little boy who was a clingy child, and was noted also by Mrs. Perrault and others that the way he would go to his mother, he would take her around the leg and cling, and he was anxious about her. He didn't understand that she would go away and come back.
Do little children love their parents even if their parents don't love them?
Yes, they do.
Now, were there behaviors that you characterized as terrorizing on the part of Mrs. Menendez between the age of Eric's age of 0 to 2?
I'm sorry.
Are there behaviors that you characterized as terrorizing? Was there psychological maltreatment under the category of terrorizing by Mrs. Menendez when Eric was under the age of 2?
Well, we talked about the driving the automobile fast and the no seat belts, and Mother was never known to intervene or when his father was frightening him.
Do you recall the testimony of Lyle Menendez in which he said that when Eric was little, he tried to join in when Jose was doing his mind thing with Lyle, and Jose would smack Eric aside?
I did.
And are you familiar with the testimony of other witnesses who talked about Jose being physically punitive of Eric when he was very small?
Yes.
And did you come upon any information that Mrs. Menendez ever protested, intervened, or stopped Mr. Menendez from hitting Eric when he was very young?
No, I did not.
Was there behavior that Mrs. Menendez either instigated or apparently condoned that was isolating when Eric was under 2?
Was there an incident that condoned?
No, were there incidents that Mrs. Menendez apparently condoned where Eric was isolated under the age of 2?
Well, one of the incidents that stands out is when he was sent to his room, and it was for, Eric would be sent to his room sometimes for as short a time as an hour or 2 overnight. And at one time, I know that Mrs. Perrault testified that she had, in the witness report I read, she had tried to intervene, and she was told to back off. That
I believe that was the other aunt, Martha Cano.
Martha Cano. Okay. Yes, Aunt Martha.
Your Honor, may I approach for a moment?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, now to move on then, Dr. Tyler, to the next developmental age. I believe you've described that as early childhood 2 to 6.
That's correct.
And again, we're focusing on the parenting that you're aware of by Mrs. Menendez. And during this age period, did you find behaviors and omissions on her part that constituted denying emotional needs?
Yes, on the 2 to 6 I did. I believe I went through that. I was moving on to the terrorization and the...
No, we were still in 0 to 2.
Okay, all right.
Do you recall the information having to do with Eric's early childhood 2 to 6 that, as well as repeating previous patterns such as no hugs, no pet names, that there was no comforting by Mrs. Menendez when Eric was hurt or when he was sick?
Yes, Eric was often left home alone while his mother would take his older brother wherever. And I know there was one incident where Eric left the house. I think he was perhaps 4 or 5, left his house to go find his mother, and she met him out on the highway. She was driving back, and he had been very frightened that she had left him. There was another incident at that age period where when he was being beaten by his father, his mother would turn up the television so that his cries wouldn't alarm her or wouldn't interfere with whatever it was she was doing, but she couldn't respond to it.
Again, is there any information from this age period that she ever intervened to stop Mr. Menendez's physical abuse or other abuse?
No, there was never any information that she would stop his abuse.
So not only did she not stop it, she just turns up the volume to whatever she's watching or listening to, and then, tune him out, all his screams and cries. These people are something else.
The other incident that I wanted to address in response to your question was the time, and this was the incident that probably appeared to me to be one of the most significant in this age period was when Eric was at a swimming pool, and the pool was very, very cold, and he was crying and he wanted to get out. And his mother reached in and grabbed him by the arm and pulled him out and sat him down, and she put a towel over his head.
What was he doing when she put the towel over
He
his
was
head?
crying, and he wanted to go home. He wanted to get out of the cold water, and she put the towel over his head and told him that no one would see his crying. And at that point, he said to her, "I'll go back into the pool." And for me, that was very significant, because that message was, there were two messages. It's not okay to be uncomfortable, to cry, to want to go home, but if we go home, I'll tell your father that you couldn't do this like a little man.
Well, what was part of what supposedly happened there that she said, "I'll take you home, and then your father will know you cried," and didn't continue swimming?
That's it.
And so rather than allow that to happen, Eric got back in the pool.
That's correct.
And what was the message to him in putting a towel over his head to hide his crying?
Well, again, the message is isolation. You know, you cry behind a towel. Nobody sees you. Nobody knows what's going on. You can't reach out for help.
Is there a theme of embarrassment that you detected in the materials? In other words, that Mrs. Menendez was very concerned with being embarrassed by her children?
Well, I think I said previously that image was an extremely important piece of this whole family. It was not what was happening in real life, but it was what they wanted other people to think was happening. And it was very important that people viewed Kitty Menendez as perfection. And if you're a perfect mother, I guess you don't have children that have needs. I'm not sure how that works.
If you're a perfect mother, do you have children who cry at the swimming pool?
I guess not in that family.
Move to strike a speculation, Your Honor.
Sustained, the answer is true.
Do you believe that part of the towel incident has to do with this desire on her part to maintain this image of false perfection?
Well, I think that's part of it, but for me, the significance of the towel over the head was reinforcing that isolation, that very pervasive theme that was beginning to demonstrate itself within this family system.
Now, at the same developmental period, are you familiar with Mrs. Menendez's practice of threatening her sons with telling their father lies about misbehavior on their part in order to get them to obey her orders?
In the age period of 6 to 12?
No, we're on
2 to 6.
Mm-hmm. Under terrorizing and threatening punishment, was that one of her methods to use Jose's power to increase her own power with the children?
Yes, and as I talked about earlier, the power base in the family, although it appeared to probably outside sources that it rested in Jose, in fact, I believe that the mother had the power, the most power in this family, because she had her own power over the children, her own need to preserve images, her own way of denying emotional responsiveness, of terrorizing the children, of isolating them. But she also had her power coupled with that of Jose Menendez. And that was a tremendous threat to this child, because she had his wrath, her wrath, his wrath, and their wrath, but their wrath was really carried by the mother. So she was able to use the threat of, "I'll tell your father, he'll deal with you."
Well, don't a lot of mothers do that? You know, a lot of exasperated moms with 6 kids who've been breaking windows with baseballs and such all day long say, "When your father gets home, I will tell him what you did."
We've all done that, I think.
How is this different than that very normal behavior?
Well, this is very different because there was no respite from this kind of threat. No respite at all.
What does that mean?
Eric knew from, as a tiny child, that no matter what happened, whether he was doing something or not doing something, that his mother had the power to get the father, to invoke the father's wrath, to get the father to deal with Eric.
So is the critical aspect here that she would threaten to get them punished even when he didn't do anything wrong?
That's correct. Throughout the later years, and perhaps you want to wait till we get into that, but it became much more evident how she exploited Eric, how she used Eric to take responsibility for some of her own inadequacies.
You're talking about the incidents where she forgets his tennis rackets, or she makes him late and then she makes him take the blame knowing he'll get hit?
Yes, and then you go on up into, I don't know if you want me to get into this, but graduation and what happens with the car accident, and she's driving and...
Okay. But let's see if we can move through this chronologically so that we can check it off and turn the page. Now, under the category of isolation, are you familiar with the material that both parents drill their children on I can't think of the word right now because I'm tired. How both of these parents lecture their children on friends and how unnecessary friends are and how limited the role or purpose of friends should be in their lives.
I think probably the example that illustrates that the best is when, but again, this is a little later on, when the boys were competing in tennis or competing in swimming, and they were told that it's really not okay to make friends of other people on the team because you're going to be competing against them. And you can't compete against somebody that you have a friendship with.
Now, are you aware that that lecture was given to Eric by his mother?
Yes.
Okay, you understand Lyle testified that he would hear that from his father, but Eric
Eric heard that from his mother.
And you're aware, are you not, that at age 6, which is part of this developmental period, Eric is already competitively swimming and playing soccer?
Yes, I am. And I am because my notation in this age period talks about the extreme pressure, and when
Extreme pressure for what?
the drilling and the pushing and the pressure to perform, the pressure to swim, the pressure to play soccer, and I think the swimming was one of the there were incidents that happened around water, not only with the competition, but also in terrorization, in terms of Eric really having some very terrorizing experiences in the water.
We'll get to those when we do the father. That mainly has to do with Mr. Menendez at this age, does it not?
It does.
Okay.
Eric did talk about hating the swimming, hating the drilling and the pushing, and he'd cry, and then his mother would threaten to tell the father.
Okay. Let's talk about one other aspect from this particular period. Under denying mental, educational, or medical needs, are you aware of the information concerning Mr. Menendez's method of teaching bike riding to Eric, where he pushes him screaming down a hill until he falls off?
Yes, it was on his 6th birthday, I believe, or 5th birthday.
Now, was it sometime after he was 6?
7th birthday, I don't know, he was still a little boy, had not yet learned to ride a two-wheel bicycle, and he was given a bicycle, a two-wheeler for his birthday, and there was a cul-de-sac, as I understand it, on this street, and Eric was told that he must get on the bike, maintain his balance, be able to negotiate, be able to ride around this cul-de-sac without falling, and he tried, I don't know how many times, but he would try it and then jump off as he would get to the cul-de-sac, and he finally was told that if you want to keep the bike, you have to get around this corner, and so he did, and in the process he fell, and he badly had a huge gash on his elbow, I believe it was, and with that, of course, he was hurt and he cried, and the father took the bicycle and took it to the garage and said, when you can learn to ride it around this cul-de-sac, you will have it back. Now, this was a bike the child had been given for his birthday, so it was given to him, and he couldn't perform in the way that he was supposed to, so it was taken back. Not only that, but he was hurt, badly hurt, when this happened, and I put that under denying medical needs because in...
well, let me just stop you for a minute. You're aware of the medical evidence that that injury to his elbow was never sutured, was never treated?
That's correct. That's what I was getting to. It was not treated, so...
And you're aware of the testimony of Alan Anderson that Mrs. Menendez was present when this method of bike riding was being taught and never intervened?
Yes.
Did not go to Eric's aid when he fell and was bleeding?
And again, that goes to the theme of isolation. This child could not really effectively go to anyone inside of the family or outside of the family to get his needs met, safety, protection.
Why don't we move now to the middle childhood period, which is 6 to 12. And under this time period, is there a persistent pattern having to do with rejecting and degrading that Mrs. Menendez engages in?
Yes. At this age, it appears that Eric could never do things right. Eric was often blamed for his mother's being late. Eric was left alone in the dark for hours.
Are you familiar from this period with the time that he is, without having to tell the story because it's already been told?
The cake incident?
No, the thunderstorm, where he's left alone in Pennington and there's a thunderstorm and he's frightened and the lights go out and he calls a cousin over. Do you recall that?
Yes, I
incident?
do.
And do you recall the mother's reaction to his having sought some company in the storm?
She was furious. She was very angry with Eric for doing that.
And to your recollection, was there rejecting and degrading name-calling type behavior that accompanied that?
Yes, she called him a baby and a sissy. And this appeared to be a rather chronic pattern. When Eric would cry, he was called a baby or a sissy.
Dr. Tyler, is there some significance to the notion of chronicity of psychological maltreatment?
Absolutely.
What does the term chronicity mean in this context?
In this context, it means something that happens time over time over time. It's not an isolated incident. It's not being called stupid one time or even really 5 times. It's on a consistent basis so that the child then internalizes that and feels that he actually is stupid, that he is a baby, that he is a sissy.
In examining and evaluating this mother's verbal interaction and physical interaction with Eric, do you find anything but these negative, maltreating behaviors?
Did she ever reward him?
No, I'm saying is based on all the information that anybody could see or give you or give us, was there anything positive that anybody was able to say she did with him?
Well, yes.
What was that?
She drove him to his lessons, his tennis lessons. She drove him to his swimming practices.
Those were all things he was being forced to do. So she might have been nice in doing those things, but she was forcing him to go to those practices and being on those, on the swim team or having to go to his tennis practices that he probably, some days just wanted to go out and be a kid and not do those things.
Let me ask you, how positive is that if he doesn't want to go to swimming practice?
Well, I was trying to think of something positive that she did, not what his perception of that would be.
Well, when I mean positive in a stroking, positive, loving sense. I don't mean an action on her part.
I can't think of anything
You were just scanning the information in your mind?
in my head.
Have you ever made note anywhere of any such thing
No, I haven't.
after reviewing all the material? Now, do you believe that everybody remembers everything that happened to them as a child?
No.
Are you familiar with the fact that when Eric Menendez testified, he indicated that there were some negative incidents that other people had testified to that he didn't remember?
I'm aware of that.
And is that common, that we all forget things, both good and bad, that happened to us in childhood?
Yes, it's very common.
And given that all the information that you have concerning Mrs. Menendez's treatment of Eric is negative, is it likely that he has forgotten a lot more negative things than what he remembers?
Objection. Call for speculation.
Sustain.
Would the memory of childhood be so selective that you'd only remember the negative things, or would you be able to remember positive things if there were any?
Objection. Call for speculation.
Overruled.
Children typically remember when you ask a child what their earliest memories are. A child can typically pull out some of the scariest memories and certainly some of the happiest memories. And I think most children, when you interview them, even tiny little children, are able to tell you about a happy birthday party or being taken for an ice cream or some of those kinds of things. So, yes, children can report both.
Do you recall interviewing Eric about some of his earliest memories?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall that he did report some happy memories?
I can't bring them up right now.
Do you recall his reporting some happy memories of when he was alone? Memories that only had himself in them and not either parent.
When he was left by himself?
No, when he was out playing. Remember trees and birds and flowers.
Yes, I do remember Eric talking about feeling, these were his adolescent, young adult words for describing how it was for him when he was little. He did feel connected somehow to nature, to trees, to bugs, to flowers, to those kinds of things.
And did he report, therefore, those kinds of happy memories from early childhood?
Those are the kinds of things that he reported is things that were basically outside of the purview of his family.
Now, returning to this middle childhood period of 6 to 12, under the category of rejecting and degrading, are you familiar with the information concerning how Mrs. Menendez dealt with Eric's learning and school performance?
Yes, I am.
And how would you characterize the way that she dealt with those issues with this child?
Well, he was constantly criticized for his schoolwork, and she would give it to him at home, and then would scream and yell at him over his inability to do the assignment. She called him stupid, and she called him dummy. And I remember one incident where he was, and this may have been, no, this was during this age period, he was put in his closet to do his work.
What?
And I think he spent the night in that closet. doing his work. I remember descriptions of Eric doing his homework and his a writing assignment, and he wasn't. This was a task that he apparently struggled with, and for good reason, it turns out, having looked at that information that arrived today on the learning disability. And he would write something, and his mother would look at it, and then she'd crumple it up or rip it up and throw it in the wastebasket and tell him to start over. And so homework and lessons and schoolwork must have been a nightmare for this child.
And was there evidence that he was, based on the school records, anxious about his school performance, worried and nervous about it?
Oh, the teachers reported that he was an extremely anxiety-ridden child. And at this time of his life, he was biting his nails to the quick.
Still
and
does.
Excuse me, could counsel's comment?
All right, let's just finish your answer, please.
yes, that was noted throughout all of the teacher reports that I reviewed, was Eric's anxiety regarding his performance, and he was very anxious to please the teachers and, of course, his parents, and he would go to the teacher and say, is this okay? Am I doing all right? Is this the answer? And seeking constant reassurance that somehow he was getting it. Those same reports, those school reports, indicated that this was a child, his anxiety was also manifested by, he had terrible stomach aches, and he would often be kept home or sent home, or the school nurse would call because of Eric's stomach aches. And apparently, I couldn't find that there was any medical cause for this, and so would have to assume that this was part of his anxiety over what was going on in his life at home and at school.
Well, if you take a child who is anxious to please, who's anxious about performance, and who has learning disabilities, and your method of teaching him is to yell and rage and scream and destroy his work, does that help?
Doesn't help any child, learning disabilities or not.
And does that kind of parental response in any way diminish anxiety? Does it increase it?
It
What impact
increases
does
the
it have?
anxiety, of course.
Your Honor, at this point, I'm going to ask for the daily break, if that's okay with the court.
All right, we'll recess. It's 10 to 5. We'll recess till tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Your Honor,
All right, the witness is back on the witness stand. Would you have a seat? State your name again for the record.
My name is Ann Tyler.
All right.
Your Honor, our position is not that the lack of this information would change her opinion, but that the presence of it supports her. That's all that's happening.
All right.
Here, have that stand.
Yes.
Dr. Tyler, you're aware of the information concerning the abusive home life that Mary Louise Menendez came from?
I am.
What significance, if any, did you attach to that information with respect to either formulating your opinion or supporting your opinion that she perpetuated that abuse in her own head?
It supported my opinion in that it is a significant correlation. A history of abuse is often repeated. I think I must say that because a person has a history of abuse or witnessing abuse does not predict that that individual will tolerate or actively perpetrate. However, when the abuse does continue in the next generation, then we do have, it's an explanatory fact, it gives you an idea of perhaps the why that the abuse is tolerated. And the entire emotional makeup of the family system is generational. And sans therapy, it often continues from one generation to the next.
Now, have you indicated that you have read the therapy notes of Mrs. Menendez, and in those notes is it confirmed that, for example, that she married a man just like her father?
Yes.
And that her...
The emotional setup is replicated.
And does that give you more confidence, in your opinion, that the acts that were described by various witnesses and the relationship between her husband, and the children, as has been presented in this courtroom, are true? Does it support your opinion that these things happen?
What things?
Her non-interference in her husband's abuse, her perpetuating abuse on the children, her denying them emotional needs, all the things that seem to be replicating her own family life.
Yes, it says nothing about the veracity of the statements of these children, but it supports the idea that the generation is, the abuse is transgenerational.
I don't understand when you say it doesn't support their veracity. They're describing behavior similar to the ones that their mother had perpetuated.
It supports it. It supports the veracity. It does not say it's the truth. It's supportive.
And does that support your opinion?
And that supports my opinion, yes, I said that.
In what way does it support your opinion? Let's assume you did not have any information about the mother's so-called abusive background. What would change, or what would be changed in your opinion about or your opinions that you've expressed here?
That's something that I always look for when I do an assessment of child abuse, actually an assessment of any kind of clinical situation that I'm presented with. I always do as extensive a genogram, a picture of the family as I can, because it does support, for instance, if I'm getting I also get a medical history of families, because if you have a family where depression is the significant, we call it genetic loading for depression, or genetic loading for schizophrenia, or genetic loading for emotional kinds of things. It supports the fact that this happened in this family. It is an important piece, a very important piece.
Are you saying that if you had not had that information provided to you, that you would not have the same opinions that you expressed here?
No, I'm not saying that. I said this is just more data to support the information that I've been given.
You indicated that in intergenerational situations, that there is some correlation between one generation and the other perpetuating the same situation. Is that correct?
Yes, I am saying that, Judge.
Okay. Is there any statistical breakdown of that in your research?
Well, the literature would support that.
And what percentage-wise, is there any breakdown of that? As to 1% of people in that situation?
I can tell you about my
1%
my own research, which was a 2.5-year study of sexual abusing perpetrators, and compared it, was a cross-matched study, compared it with a non-clinic population of fathers who were matched for age and type of incest perpetration and the socioeconomic status, and that was the most, I did a what we call a statistical manipulation of the data, a multiple discriminant function analysis, threw all my data into the computer and asked that which of the variables, the historical variables, were the most significant in predicting this abuse which had occurred. Yeah. And the number one predictor was the history of the perpetrator having been abused or been from an abusive background himself.
All right, and earlier you indicated that such a history does not predict abuse in the next generation.
Well, that's my data. Most research in child abuse is retrospective because you can't set up an abuse situation. It's not ethical. You have to use data that's been given to you. You have to know that something occurred. So you don't use it as a. It would not be fair to predict that one of these children will abuse in the next generation, but there would be a very high possibility that would happen unless there was some significant treatment, significant therapy.
Right, that's what I was asking you. When we say very high possibility, is that broken down in any fashion as far as percentages?
Well, in my particular research, that percentage was 94%.
94% what?
94% of the perpetrators had come from an abusive home.
Okay.
And that's very, very significant statistically.
All right, and did either side wish to inquire further?
Yes.
Okay.
Ma'am, did you do any kind of generational history on Mr. Menendez, the father?
I did.
And did you find that he had been brought up in an abusive home?
Yes.
Okay. Did you find that he had been the victim of sexual abuse?
I did not find that.
Okay. But according to the statistics, if he was in fact a sexual abuser of his children, statistically he would have had to have been sexually
And
abused.
he may have. I don't have that information.
And the reason you don't have it is what?
Is because I didn't get information from his father or his mother or his siblings.
And that would have been helpful, correct?
That would have, any information in this regard is helpful.
Now, the information on Mrs. Menendez was gained from her sisters, is that
That's
correct?
correct.
And you were not able to interview her father because he was deceased.
Right.
You were not able to interview her mother because she was deceased.
That's correct.
And were you aware of the fact that the father, Mrs. Menendez's father, was out of the home on a full-time basis when she was 3 years old?
That's
I
correct.
object to that statement. That misstates the facts. In fact, the evidence is that he was frequently in the home.
All right, that's one of the issues, and we can break this down a little bit. That's one of the issues that concerns the court. The court did not have any reservations about the general principle that if there was abuse in one generation, it could very well pass on to another generation. That's pretty much accepted, and no one is disputing that as a general proposition that does happen. The concern the court has is as to the remoteness of this information, that what the defense intends to do and has been proposing to do here, and what counsel referred to inaccurately is what the court well knows about the abuse in some prior generation. The court does not well know that. The court has been provided with some information by counsel of interviews with certain relatives of Mrs. Menendez. And the reason that has been provided to the court is that the counsel want to introduce these witnesses to testify about these matters. And that has been reserved until some later time to determine whether it's relevant, has some probative value. And what concerns the court, and why I've sustained objections yesterday on the subject, is that this material is very remote. And what we've just witnessed here, a little dispute between counsel about a fact of when somebody was living in a house 50 years ago or 40 years ago, in essence, will result in a trial and a consumption of a considerable amount of time about these facts that occurred 30, 40, or 50 years ago in another house, another state, another time, another family, and all for the purpose of what has been put forward here, which at best can be categorized as some support for the testimony of this witness, which is basically supported by, in great extent and almost to total extent, on the information that she was provided of what went on and what did not go on in the household of Jose and Mary Louise Menendez and Eric and Lyle Menendez. If she had not had that information, if she only had the fact that there was some abuse in the home of Mary Louise Menendez when she was a child, her testimony would be inadmissible. It wouldn't be offered. It wouldn't be here at all. And what concerns this court is that we would get into a trial situation over these remote events that have very little probative value and do tend and would consume a great deal of time. There will be disputes, no doubt. Some relatives will come in and say these events happened 30 or 40 years ago, and other relatives will come in and say they didn't happen. And we'll sit here and try to figure out whether it did or didn't and for what purpose. It doesn't really prove or disprove or change this witness's opinion. Her opinion would be the same regardless of whether she had this information or not. And I assume all the other defense experts would be in the same situation. So what the court's concern is that we would get into an area of a great deal of litigation, generate a lot of heat and very little light, and we would spend a lot of time discussing matters that ultimately don't have very much at all to do with what happened on August the 20th. Well, let's hear Ms. Abramson first, since this is her witness.
I think the court keeps disconnecting this evidence from what happened on August 20th in an artificial way. One of the key issues here is Mary Louise Menendez's tolerance of the abusive behavior of her husband as well as her own abusive behavior. Now, she tells her therapist that she married someone like her father. That tells us something about her father right there. But in addition to that, the fact that she was raised in a household with violence is not contested. I mean, even though you have only seen the testimony, or the proposed testimony of one sister, there are other witnesses who verified that, but we weren't trying to do a big mini-trial of that issue. But the crucial thing here is the credibility of the defendants and the credibility of the defense witnesses, and the likelihood that if she were raised in such an environment, if she admits she's married into such an environment, that corroborates what the defendants are saying, that she tolerated this abuse and participated in it. I don't see how this leads to a huge trial, because we're not going to try to prove all the acts of abuse that occurred to her or occurred in her home. But only the general, we all model on our parents to some extent. And the point here is there were certain messages that came from her household that you can see in her behavior she clearly accepted and patterned her life after. Okay? One of those messages was that abuse is normative because it happened at this point. Another message is that divorce is totally destructive of a woman because her mother, and there is no dispute about this, was completely destroyed by the divorce of that family. The other message is that mothers who are completely taken up in their own problems are emotionally unavailable to their children, and that's okay, because that's what happened in that family. And the fourth message was what the world thinks of you is the single most important thing in your life, which was her mother's message, her family's message, and her message. And so in that sense, we're trying to show that what has been perceived about her is supported by what she had to model on. And that's what we are all like that. We are all either the direct reflection of our parents or their willful opposites. And so it does tend to be reason to support that she is and has these views that we have put into evidence.
May I be heard, please?
I think I'd like Ms. Lansing to be here because she has been working with these witnesses and I think has a clearer factual record.
Well, bear in mind, we don't have her client here, and if this is going to go beyond this witness's testimony, then we should have him here for that purpose.
I think it would, because I think it will come up with, certainly with their experts, as well as with my next expert.
Well, at this point, I want to just complete this witness's testimony and decide whether or not it's relevant to her testimony. So let's hear from the prosecution.
Your Honor, there are certain aspects of this discussion which would be beneficial for the people's case. However, the basis of the opinion of the experts is based upon derivative information. None of the participants, neither Mrs. Menendez nor her mother nor her father, are alive or were alive to be examined. And because of that, for instance, one of the statements made by Ms. Abramson is that Mary Louise Menendez told her psychologist that she married someone like her father. We don't know what she meant by that. She could have meant he was a strong person and a good provider. We don't know if she meant that in a pejorative sense or in a complimentary sense. And since she's not here to cross-examine, we don't know exactly what she meant by that statement. And so a lot of this information is basically just unreliable. People can extrapolate whatever they want from it, but that's not the kind of evidence that should be presented to a jury. It's where everybody can make whatever they want and there's no clear significance to it.
Well, it's also hearsay. If you look at it just from that point, if that's her state of mind, that's what she said she did, then that's hearsay. It's offered for the truth. That's what she did. We're not talking about that. We're just, at this point, talking just about this offer of proof relating to what this witness has been provided about the family background of Mrs. Menendez, her upbringing, and whether or not it has any relevance to these proceedings.
Really is a matter of expert opinion. If people have an expert who's going to come on and say there's no such thing as intergenerational.
No one's saying that. The people aren't saying that. No one is at all saying that. But what I'm saying is that this witness would not be testifying about any of these matters if all she had was the family history that you offer regarding how Mrs. Menendez was raised. That would not prove anything. And she would say it doesn't predict anything. It doesn't predict that Mrs. Menendez would have been involved in or tolerated any of this activity just because of that. The only basis of this witness's opinions about what happened in the home and her opinions about the defendant and his the impact it had upon him, if any, is really all the events that have been described and the actual events in the home.
Not every single piece of evidence has to stand on its own to prove the ultimate fact.
No dispute about that.
Corroborative. I think the witness would like to address the
Well, yeah, one other thing. It seems to me a lot of this evidence really is being put forward with a defense theory that it would support just one statement made by Mrs. Menendez on the night of August the 20th, that she did not have any help in her life or something along those lines, and that all of this information is really being put forward just to support whether she did say that or not.
It never occurred to me.
Okay, well, now I'm giving you something else to argue.
Yes, thank you very much, but that's not what I had in mind at all. What I have in mind is, we had information that what was done to her in some respects was identical behavior to what she then did to Eric when he was a youngster. It's simply to show that the allegation that she engaged in this behavior is credible.
Well, I suppose we can get her grandmother's history and the great-grandmother's history, and we can go back and prove that it was all corroborated throughout history that way, and go back to Plymouth Rock, whoever it was, when they arrived, and figure out.
I think they came probably in manship rather than Plymouth
Whatever.
Rock. But the point is that we're not trying to do that, so why speculate to other more outrageous things that we're not trying to do?
Your Honor,
Yeah.
may I say one thing?
Sure.
One of the reasons that I think it would be important for the jury to hear is that it does, most lay people have a very difficult time, particularly mothers of children, understanding how a mother could allow things to happen to her child that were of an abusive nature. And I think the notion of the transgenerational abuse helps them understand that a mother does not have to be a schizophrenic to tolerate the kind of abuse that occurs in a home. That it's a form of conditioning.
Aren't there individuals who react to that and say, it happened to me, I'm not going to let it happen to my children?
Yes, there are.
Is that unusual?
It depends. It depends upon, many other factors.
I would think that it's not the majority who decide that I'm going to decide not to mistreat my kids. I think some people don't realize the effects that it's actually had on them and how they might take it out on their kids. So they might not even know that they're mistreating them.
That's what I'm saying. It depends on other factors that are
But it's
more current with what was occurring rather than some distant events, wouldn't you say?
But it is a significant part of the picture in an abusive family, particularly in an incest family, because there's some other things that are very characteristic of incest families, that such as the secrecy, which is talked about by Mrs. Menendez's family and by her therapist.
What are you talking about, incest? In relationship to what?
Incest is as being a secret that's kept.
Incest in which relationship?
Incest between a father and a son, between a mother and a daughter, between a father and a daughter, an incestuous family.
Is there
enmeshed
information
family.
that there was firm evidence of incest in the mother's background that you're aware of?
No, there was not.
All right, so that is not a factor that was presented to you.
But the enmeshment of the family, the closed family, is information that was presented to me. It was not. There were secrets within that family, and Mrs. Menendez alluded to those two secrets to her therapist. So I think it's the type of system, the type of family that these boys are raised in. The emotional climate may have been replicated in this generation by the emotional climate in Mary Louise Menendez's family.
Sure.
I think that there are dramatic patterns, similarity in patterns in the family that Kitty Menendez was raised in and the one that she then raised her own children in. And I think by a study of or an evaluation of the home in which she grew up, it becomes very clear how she could have recreated this home life for her own children. Among the patterns are an alcohol problem in the home in which she grew up and an alcohol problem she suffered from all of her life. She witnessed her father not only beat her mother on a regular basis, but beat her brother. And when her mother interfered to try to protect the brother was beaten, and then the mother was beaten, which I'm sure had a very strong message for her in terms of what she was going to do to protect the children as she grew up. The divorce did take place when Kitty was 3 years old, but the father returned to the home 2 to 3 times a week for the next 4 to 5 years, and then approximately once a week for the next 20 years. And he returned to the home in a father-type role because he returned to the home to continue the sexual relationship that he had with the mother during that period of time, and was clearly around Kitty all of her growing up years. The family talked about the abuse that had occurred even when she was small, and I'm sure that Dr. Tyler and other experts would concede that watching your mother and brother beaten even when you are under 3 years of age is going to have an important impression on you, and then hearing about it all of your growing up in adult years, having it discussed regularly is going to further impact you. She grew up in a very small town in which the father's cheating subsequent remarriage and cheating on that wife with Kitty's mother and other women was a source of great shame and humiliation.
You realize what you're really talking about here, putting on a whole life history of other people and some small town event that you're now depicting.
We're talking about what Kitty's most important experiences were in formative years, and we're talking about putting it on through one witness who can do it in an hour. And I don't think that these facts would be disputed. After the father left and remarried, the mother went into a significant depression, which the family talked about as a nervous breakdown. She continued to be loyal to, in love with, and doting on the man she had been married to for the rest of her life, and expressed that divorce was not an option. I think a message which was extremely significant for Kitty Menendez when she then found out that she was re-experiencing her mother's life with regard to her husband's infidelity. There are specific patterns of behavior which these children, which Eric and Lyle experienced, which are exactly the same as happened to Kitty in their home, including things such as being pulled by the hair and called a dummy. There was a clear message that the allegiance was to the husband over the children, and that was something the children grew up knowing, and which Kitty then replicated in her own family. There was an acceptance of the fact that your mother would be emotionally unavailable to you because of her own preoccupation with her own problems. And the experts would say that this made it impossible for Kitty to bond with her mother, and subsequently greatly impaired the possibility that she would ever bond significantly or successfully with her children. I think that these patterns are quite dramatic. The secrecy, the importance of image. Kitty rebelled initially by marrying someone who was totally unacceptable to the family because he was Cuban, and received a lot of disapproval for that, but once he became rich and successful, she was the star of the family. And that image became extremely important to her, and one that she would defend at all costs, is our position. She continued to lie to the remainder of her family about any of the personal problems she was having so that she could maintain this image. I think that all of these factors not only corroborate the information that the children gave about what their life was like growing up in that home, but also explain how she could end up in the position she was, where she was so depressed, suicidal, so upset over her husband's infidelity, which repeated the experience she had with her own father, and yet could not leave. That was not an option for her. And I think the experts will explain that all of these factors are extremely important, not only in corroborating the testimony of Eric and Lyle Menendez, but in explaining that the behavior they saw in their mother was to be expected, given what her experience had been. And I don't think that the court has indicated that it's aware of the intergenerational correlation. It is just as if you go to a medical doctor, they're going to want to know if you have heart disease in your family or cancer in your family, because it is true that the fact that your parents may have died of cancer doesn't mean you are going to, but it makes it far more likely that you are. And so the fact that Kitty Menendez experienced is highly traumatic.
Whoops. I did not mean to pause that, sorry.
Childhood, and that had many of the very same issues arise in her adult life. And in giving your own children, makes it far more likely that the facts as reported by Lyle and Eric Menendez are in fact accurate, and that the behavior that she was demonstrating was in fact totally consistent with her experience in life.
All right, let me hear from the people your position.
Your Honor, at the beginning of the trial, the people agreed that we would not object to the kind of testimony which is outlined in 1107 of the Evidence Code. But what this is like doing a psychological evaluation of a victim, let's say a male victim in a battered wife case, proving that that person was a batterer, not only because he battered the wife, but because he came from a battering family, and therefore it buttresses the idea that the defendant in the case is a victim of battered wife syndrome. I think it stretches too far afield. I don't think it is a proper subject of expert testimony when the issue here is what was the defendant's state of mind on the night of August the 20th, 1989, and what factors in their lives caused them to arrive at that state of mind. It's my understanding that this witness isn't even going to talk about their state of mind on the night of the crime.
But these are factors that contribute to the dynamic of the family, and it's extremely important to understand what was going on in that household. These things, the way that you grew up is going to affect the way that you raise your family. It just makes sense. I mean, common sense here, people. Why wouldn't that be something that would be an important factor in determining how we got here?
But that I suppose her diagnosis will be used for other experts to render that kind of opinion, which is the only thing that people agreed would be admissible in this trial without protest. But to say that because a victim fits a pattern, therefore the defendant fits a pattern, which is therefore admissible under 1107 or like cases, is stretching the use of expert testimony and is getting too far afield of the issue that we're here to try, which is the defendant's state of mind on the night of the murders, not how the victim felt when she was being raised during the Second World War, which is when these incidents would have occurred.
Absolutely, was raised during the Second World War. And I think the people are, again, oversimplifying what the issues are. The issues of credibility are very much significant issues in this case. And for a jury to believe that Mrs. Menendez did these things and was the type of person that her children described, it obviously would be useful for them to know that she is patterning and repeating behavior from her childhood. And that does not stretch beyond 1107. 1107 is not limited to simply an analysis or diagnosis or evaluation of the battered wife, because you cannot describe one person in a two-person game by ignoring the other half. And in every battered wife case, the propensities, the patterns, the habits, the practices, the characteristics, the personality of the batterer is an issue. And this is just a very small extension of that evidence, which has been presented in this case already, and does help the jury understand why she behaves the way she does. And if people don't understand why people behave a certain way, it leaves a hole in their ability to credit the evidence that they're hearing about that person's behavior.
Well, 1107 of the Evidence Code, which was enacted in 1991 and became effective in 1992, is a section that deals with battered women's syndrome, and it's a provision in the Evidence Code that deals with the admissibility of evidence. It does not deal with any substantive rules of law in regards to what is or what is not a legal defense. It only deals with what evidence may or may not be received during a trial. And people, by their pleading filed in this trial prior to opening statements, conceded that this section would be equally applicable to the issues in this case relating to the defendants as sons of the decedents, and in relationship to the defense contention that the defendants were subject to abuse analogous to that which gives rise to a diagnosis of battered woman syndrome. And Section 1107 basically says, or does say in its language, expert testimony is admissible by either the prosecution or the defense regarding battered woman syndrome, including the physical, emotional, or mental effects upon the beliefs, perceptions, or behavior of victims of domestic violence. And that's all it says. And it doesn't go anything further than that as to what is or what is not admissible, other than the foundational aspect of it, that this is not to be regarded as some new and untested theory, but is to be accepted as a principle that is not in dispute, that there is such a concept of battered woman syndrome. But the focus of the Evidence Code is that it relate to or include physical, emotional, or mental effects upon the beliefs, perceptions, or behavior of victims of domestic violence. Now, the defense position is one of two here, both that Mrs. Mary Louise Menendez was a victim of domestic violence, and therefore this code section applies to her in relationship to her upbringing. Or secondly, that anything that happened to Mr. or Mrs. Menendez as a child somehow is relevant and admissible in this trial regarding the physical, emotional, or mental effects upon the beliefs, perceptions, or behavior of the defendants, who the defense contends are victims of domestic violence. And as I've indicated, the court's concern is, number one, whether this is too remote as an offer of proof. We've had the witness describe her analysis of the information as to how it could be helpful to the jury in understanding the mother's activities and her state of mind. But this witness did not examine the mother and did not and does not purport to be presenting evidence regarding the mother's state of mind. It's my understanding that she's been called to testify regarding the beliefs, perceptions, or behavior of the defendants. And that is why she is being called as a witness, and that's why it's being permitted under Section 1107 of the Evidence Code, and not as an expert who is dealing with the mother's perceptions, beliefs, or behavior. Because if so, then we do end up with a trial that will cause us to go back in depth, I suppose, to the mother's history of what happened to her at every stage of her life, and whether she learned to ride a bike with trainer wheels or not, or whether...
How long is that? I mean, seriously, how long is it going to take? A few extra minutes in their testimony? Seriously, so we can understand the pattern of in the cycle of what was going on in that house from generations before. I mean, this is important context that the jury needs.
all these other incidents that have been described in regards to the defendants occurred to her. And in reality, that's what we'd be facing here as far as a trial dealing with all sorts of other facts that occurred many, many years ago. And the court has to balance the remoteness of that and the potential for undue consumption of time. And although it's been presented that this would take like an hour, quite clearly it wouldn't, because you'd have all the description of what occurred, and then you'd have the cross-examination, then you'd have the experts digesting all of that and reciting in detail how all that might have possibly affected the mother and her perceptions and her beliefs and her attitudes and everything else. And then cross-examination on that, well, maybe it didn't do that, but it could have done that, and it might have had that impact on the mother, maybe it didn't. And we could spend a lot of time on that. We'd be...
And if we spend a lot of time on that, so what? These boys' lives are on the line. They are on trial for, and the sentence is prison for the rest of their lives. So it's kind of a big deal to get it right and to present the evidence the right way the first time.
really having a trial on all these other matters that go far afield from what is the issue in this case. So that is the court's concern. I've said it before, and I've just restated it, that we get into a evidence code section 352 situation as to how much time is going to be consumed and how little probative value this would have in the overall understanding of these events. I heard nothing from this witness to describe or say what that she would be in a position to say that this information or evidence would explain what the mother actually did on August the 20th, 1989. Only that it might explain what her attitudes were and what she was doing years before then.
The point is well, strike that. The point is that Mary Louise Menendez's state of mind is an issue in the case. On the issues of the abuse that she visited on her children. It isn't just her state of mind based on her prior abuse, but all throughout the trial, it's been clear that her attitude towards her children, as reflected in her action, is an issue and is relevant on the simple notion that actions in conformity with particular states of mind are corroborated by those states of mind. And throughout the testimony, her attitudes towards children, towards child rearing, have been presented as corroborative of her actual behaviors in that regard. And all this is another tiny piece explaining those attitudes. It is not some new area of the trial. And frankly, Your Honor, if we spent more time talking about why it shouldn't come in than it would have taken to prove it, since we only have one witness to prove it through, and there is no, Ms. Lansing has made basically the entire offer of proof on what that witness would testify to. So we're not going to get into bicycle riding accidents. I think the court is grossly overstating the amount of time it would take to prove this and any distraction it might have to the jury. It's just a very simple issue that, the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. It's sort of a simple proposition, but it would be difficult for the jury to accept that this woman would simply engage in these behaviors with no precursor in her own life, but very easy for them to understand, as with their own lives, that you tend to pattern and mimic what happens to you. It is not a highly sophisticated concept, but it is a necessary part, we believe, in their understanding what this witness is testifying about, which is not just the perceptions of my client, but the family system that led to those perceptions. Because his perceptions in a vacuum are meaningless. His perceptions in view of how that family operated and how each member of that family operated are what can inform the jury so that they can reach their conclusions.
All right, let me hear from the prosecution in response. This is the one issue here that has been alluded to as far as the amount of time that would be consumed by this.
Yes,
I have no idea what your information or evidence would be.
It's my understanding that in order to substantiate this proposition, they proposed to call Joan Vandermolen, who was an older sister of Kitty Menendez, Pat Anderson, who was her sister-in-law, Dr. Summerfield, Cox, and Emery. Then we would be in a position to call Kitty Menendez's two brothers, Milton and Brian Anderson, who I don't know if they were interviewed or considered by Dr. Tyler in her evaluation. Those were her brothers. So
what would they be testifying about?
They would be disputing some of the factual underpinnings of this opinion and also indicate some, I believe, bad blood on the part of some of these witnesses. So because of that, I think we are going to end up with quite a bit of consumption of time because of the fact that we are not going to lay down and let this evidence be presented without trying to dispute it.
First of all, Dr. Cox, Dr. Emery, Dr. Summerfield are not being offered really to show Kitty's history of abuse. That's the tiniest portion of their testimony. I mean, their testimony is relevant with respect to Kitty's actual attitudes towards her children and her actual behaviors towards her children, which she had reported to them, and her clinical diagnosis, which is reflected in her behavior towards and around her children. So that's a smoke screen that they're being called on this issue, because that's no.
Pat Anderson is not being called on this issue. The one witness we would be calling on this issue is a previously protected witness. But she would be the only witness, and the court has an outline of the material we intended to elicit from her.
All right.
I do expect that it would be brief. I would be surprised if the people had witnesses to put on in opposition, but they might.
But we've never been given discovery of any contrary views.
Well, they don't have to at this point since the witness hasn't testified.
Right. I'm just.
Given interviews with these witnesses that don't show any
I mean, recent interviews or?
Yeah, we were ordered not to contact these people because they were protected. It's the court will recall.
Milton Anderson's a recent interview with Milton Anderson.
All right, that's true. The defense requested that the prosecution not interview these people in relationship to this particular information that was being provided by this witness.
No, we did not.
So,
Those are the only two interviews.
I do not. I'm. As to one, I'd be very surprised if there'd be any disagreement with the position we would be putting on. As to the other, I don't know. But I do not. This is not a situation where there are a great number of witnesses. These are things that occurred in the home, in a very secretive family on its own, and there are very few recipient witnesses. There are only 3 living. One we intend to put on, and the prosecution would have available to them the other 2 for whatever it is they would say. And as I say, I wouldn't expect contradiction from one at least. The other, I don't know.
Your Honor, if the court allows this kind of testimony, is the court going to permit the people to argue that Jose Menendez was not a child molester because he wasn't molested, and 94% of this kind of abuse is intergenerational, and since there's no evidence he was molested, that he's not a child molester?
I'm not ruling on any
well,
such.
But I mean that seems to be what we should be entitled to do if this kind of information is presented to the jury. So as I said earlier, there are things that we can make of this as prosecutors that would help our case. But I don't think that this kind of information is reliable enough for an expert to present it to a jury and to allow the jury and the defense to use that information for whatever purpose they see fit. It's just not reliable enough. Under Evidence Code Section 803, this kind of information should not be presented to the jury.
When you say reliable, in what context are you saying it's not reliable? It didn't happen, or that it's just...
It's a very one-sided presentation by the people who could dispute it are all dead. And so in making psychological evaluations, I think one thing psychologists like to do is to interview the participants if they can. Now, Mr. Menendez, Mrs. Menendez, and their parents, aside from one mother, are all dead. And so basically, we're not in a position to dispute much of it because the participants are dead. There are blanket statements from which inferences can be drawn that are not that are so speculative that it's hard to imagine what they mean. For instance, one of the things that has been referred to is that Kitty Menendez told her therapist she had secrets. I'm sure the defense wants to argue that that secret was that her husband.
Okay, again, we're going beyond this limited issue here. So let's
Yes, but it seems to me that if we get into a trial of the victim's childhood, that we are getting rather far afield of the issue of what happened on the night of August the 20th.
Okay, I've already said that. I used the word remote. Right, the court, having heard the position of the parties here, number one, just to... Sure, I'd be more than happy to hear that, but could we go ahead with this witness before the jury on other matters so that the jury can come out and you can do that later?
Yes, I could, but I would be asking you for a brief break. I know the jury's been locked up since 9. I just need a few minutes.
Sure. Okay, I'll give you...
Go ahead if you want to reserve ruling. I'll call Dr. Burgess after.
Yeah, if you want to make a further offer of proof, I'll be glad to hear it. But I would like to go forward with this witness's testimony on everything else, and I'll give you until 20 minutes too, and we'll give... Well, it's be 17 minutes. They'll get the jury a break too because they've been in the jury room. So we'll resume at 22.
An extensive brief on this issue, which explores not only 1107 of the evidence code, but 1103 as a basis for the admissibility of this particular type of evidence.
That primarily dealt with the psychiatrist, or rather psychotherapist, who treated Mrs. Menendez more than this information, but it does touch on it, and I'm certainly aware of it. And at this point, I was not addressing that aspect of it in regards to the therapist who treated Mrs. Menendez. That's a separate issue that we can deal with. But at this point, I was just dealing with the family history. So we'll take a break, and we'll resume at 20 minutes to give the jury. We have the defendant, Eric Menendez, in court, as well as all counsel and the prosecution and the jury. I'm sorry for the delay, ladies and gentlemen, but this was an issue that arose here in court that the lawyers and I were discussing. It took us a little while to do that. Let me give you a little information at this point. As I've indicated to you during jury selection and at the early stages of the trial, at the end of the trial, I'll be giving you instructions on all areas of law that apply to your decision-making process, or the decision-making process that you'll be involved with at the end of the trial. At this point, let me just say, in regards to testimony of witnesses who testify as experts or are called to testify as expert witnesses, such witnesses may rely upon evidence that has been received during the course of the trial, and also rely on or refer to other information that has not been introduced during the course of the trial. And they may consider both such to form opinions that they'll testify about during the course of their testimony. The fact that they have relied upon this information, whether it's evidence in the courtroom or information that they've received outside of the courtroom, does not mean that this evidence has been or is to be considered as the truth of what has been considered by the experts. Say, for example, the witness has considered some information that was provided to the witness outside of the courtroom. The fact the witness then tells you about that information doesn't mean that that information is accurate or truthful. It's just information the witness has received and will use to evaluate and make an opinion, form an opinion. Likewise, evidence has been received during the course of the trial, perhaps that the witness has referred to, and you've seen those witnesses testify and you've seen the evidence presented, and it will be for you to evaluate that evidence and information that you saw in the courtroom to decide whether you accept it or reject it or how you view it. And when the witness refers to that evidence or to information outside of the trial, the witness does so and assumes that information is accurate and correct for the purpose of forming opinions that the witness will then tell you about. You are not to assume that the incidents or facts related by the expert witness are true just because the witness makes that assumption that they are true. Ultimately, it will be your decision as to how to evaluate the evidence and information. What I'm going to do at the end of the trial is give you more detailed instructions on this and other areas of the law. And at the end of the trial, I'll give you instructions on this particular subject in a little different way. It'll be a more formalized fashion, and the words will be a little different. I want you to know that whatever I tell you about the law during the trial, during the time we're taking testimony, is not the final version of the rules that will apply to your deliberations. Those rules will be given to you in their entirety at the end of the trial, and it is those words and those rules and the instructions I give you at the end of the trial which will govern you during your deliberations. At this point, I just wanted to give you a little input during the course of the trial, dealing with the portion of the evidence being received here. All right, are we ready to proceed?
Yes, sir. I'd like to remain at council table with the court's permission.
I'm sorry?
I'd like to remain at council table.
Certainly.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, you heard the instruction that the judge just gave to the jury?
I did.
Now, when you are doing an assessment, and particularly when you are doing one for forensic purposes, to come to a court and take the oath and testify, are you interested at all in whether the information you're relying on for your opinion is true?
Yes, of course.
And what do you do in your evaluation to determine the credibility of the information upon which you are relying?
Well, in this case, I attempted to corroborate with third-party reports as many of the statements that Eric Menendez had given me as I possibly could, and I did that by relying upon the witness interviews that had been provided to me.
And with respect to those witness interviews, do you examine them or evaluate them in any way to determine if they are credible?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if a witness, tells you that he saw elephants fly, do you accept that?
If a witness tells me he saw elephants fly, do I accept that? Well,
Yes.
no, I can't accept that.
But my point is, what standards do you use to determine whether the interviews that you read, the third-party corroborating interviews, are themselves accurate?
I have to rely upon the people that did the interviewing, and I have to rely upon the individuals that gave me those interviews to peruse and to draw my conclusions from.
Do you look for consistency and patterns in these interviews that support their credibility?
I look for internal. I was talking initially about external consistency when I say I have to rely on the sources that gave me the information. But then in terms of the information that's included within those interviews, it's very important to look at the internal consistency of those interviews.
And if you've received interviews from witnesses and then those same witnesses have testified and have been cross-examined and the information they give under oath is consistent with the interview, does that give you any indication of reliability?
Yes, it does.
And if in evaluating witness interviews you have no information from any source that any of the witnesses have any motive to fabricate or to lie or to make things up, does that validate the credibility?
Yes.
Now, does it also matter if the witnesses that you're reading are people who, because of their relationship with the decedents or their relationship with the defendants, would appear to be in a position to have reliable information? Does that weigh in your assessing its credibility?
Indeed, it does.
Now, let's turn to where we were yesterday. I believe we were discussing your evaluation from a psychological maltreatment standpoint of the behaviors of Mrs. Menendez towards her children. And specifically her interactions with Eric Menendez between his ages of 6 to 12 years. I believe yesterday you had indicated those behaviors you were aware of that constituted rejecting and degrading by Mrs. Menendez towards Eric. Do you recall that?
Yes. I don't recall how far we got, however.
Neither do I. But maybe I have a clue here. I do believe that you discussed yesterday some of the names, some of the negative or pejorative names that she would routinely call him, such as baby and sissy and stupid and dummy and those things. And I believe you discussed her behavior with respect to his schoolwork. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, was there a pattern that you see emerging at this point having to do with Mrs. Menendez blaming Eric for something?
Yes, that pattern was consistent throughout all the developmental periods that I looked at in terms of blaming Eric. Probably everyone has heard these incidents, the blaming for when she'd be, blaming Eric for when she would be late. There was a specific incident about Eric not having his tennis rackets
Yes.
for a tournament. And
They've had
that. Okay, those kinds of things.
Was there anything about her blaming Eric, and Lyle for that matter, for her problems or inadequacies or life or that sort of thing?
Well, she often made a statement, or I read it in two different reports, that this is a quote, "I wish you were never born."
And in what context would that be said?
When she would have problems, when she was angry, when she was miserable, when she was sad, she would blame Eric for her feelings, how she felt about life.
And what message would that convey to a child that because his mother is having problems, his birth somehow is connected to that?
Well, the message that it conveys is that somehow this child is responsible for his mother and what happens in his mother's life, and especially how his mother feels.
And is that a healthy message to be giving to a child 6 to 12 years old?
No, it's a very damaging message. It's a damaging message for any individual to believe that they are somehow responsible for how another person feels.
Is it particularly damaging when the person who's being made to feel responsible is a child?
Oh, yes. A child doesn't have any previous experience, only his own, to be able to judge those kinds of statements. And this was a child who, I think I've already talked about his self-esteem, which was very low.
Is this the kind of behavior that can invoke guilt in a child, make them feel guilty for their parents' unhappiness?
Yes.
And did you see in the materials efforts on Eric's part to somehow make up to his mother for his having been born and her troubles that ensued?
Director, calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
Yes. Was there evidence in either the testimony of Eric or the testimony of other witnesses that he was attempting to do things for his mother?
Yes. Yes, there was. I think I've talked about some of that.
Right. Turning to the next category, which is terrorizing, were there behaviors of Mrs. Menendez during the 6 to 12 period that fit the category, come within the category of terrorizing behavior?
Well, I think the aggressiveness, which was corroborated by many of the sources, many of the witness reports that I read, her lack of ability to control her temper, her rages. They were described by several sources as rages where she would yell and scream. And the defendant described that it was not uncommon during one of these rages for her to grab him by the hair and scream at him, pull his hair, and on one occasion or more would kick him. Can we keep going?
Well, let me ask you something about this. Why is a parent's anger or rage terrorizing?
Well, because you're a child, and the difference between just size alone between a little boy and a mother, and the little boy even at 18, when I was getting a description of the mother, the boy still perceives the mother as strong and physically muscular and powerful from a physical point of view. So that's the difference in size alone is frightening to a child because the parent has more power. And then, of course, parents have more power because they're a parent and they are the bosses in the household. And this parent made all choices for this child. What he ate, what he wore, what sports he played.
To focus back on the rages, though, is there something about the fact that they've been characterized as seemingly out of control that made them more frightening than just a parent, getting angry and screaming and telling you to go to your room?
Well, yes, I think an out-of-control person is frightening for even adults because we don't know how to stop that out-of-control behavior. And if you're a child and your parent is out of control, that would be very frightening because the child has no ability to get the behavior to stop.
Are children only afraid of parents actually hitting them physically when they're angry, or is there something about parental anger that invokes fear even when there's no physical contact?
Objection leading.
Yes, I hope I do. Your question is there something besides the actual physical hands-on that would engender terror and in a child?
Well, the question is does anger frighten children even if they're not hit or even if they don't expect to get hit?
Anger is very frightening for children because they can't predict, unless they've had a lot of experience with a parent, what's going to happen next. And if they build on their experiences. We all build on our experiences, but if your experience as a child is when your mother gets angry, she rages, and she goes out of control, and you don't know what she's going to do, then that is terrorizing.
Is it scary for a child to see a parent out of control, even if the parent doesn't turn that into a physical assault?
Yes, it's very frightening.
Why?
Because the child feels totally unprotected and totally unsafe, and sometimes children have no place to go.
You know the expression when children talk about, gee, I'm afraid to tell this to my dad because he'll get angry. And hypothetically, let's say that this person's not afraid that the father's anger is going to lead to a physical assault, but are children commonly just afraid of angering
Children
their parents?
want to be loved by their caretaker. That's one, going back to that first developmental period, that is the one thing that children have to have, just like food. They have to have that kind of nurturance. And a parent's anger is always threatening to the child and the child's sense of being loved, of being accepted, of being able to trust. And as I reviewed these records, addressing that very issue, I think this boy loved his mother and continued to express love for his mother up until the time that I interviewed him. And
Your Honor, I move to strike everything after I think as being speculation on the part of the witness.
Objection sustained. Yes, sir.
Did you form an opinion based on all of the materials that you had read and your assessment of Eric Menendez concerning what his feelings were towards his mother?
Objection, improper opinion.
Did Eric express love for his mother to you during your interviews with him?
yes,
Objection hearsay.
Eric did express love for his mother, and he expressed that he had wanted her love always, and he was continuing to express love the last time I saw him.
And the last time you saw him was when?
Last August. August of 1993.
This August?
This August. 2 months ago.
Now, did you also, I'll strike that. Also under the category of terrorizing, did you classify Mrs. Menendez's threats to turn Eric in effect, to his father?
Yes, I think that was a terrorizing for the child, too. And more than that, it was isolating Eric, because a child who is frightened usually has someone that they can talk to about being frightened. And Eric could not turn to his father when his mother would rage or scare him or when his mother was late or forgot the tennis rackets or any of those other things, because he knew that his father then would punish him. I think Eric perceived his father, as I said yesterday, as another arm of his mother in terms of her ability to discipline him.
And did he perceive his mother as another arm of his father as well?
Did he perceive his mother as an arm of his father?
Yes.
I think definitely in the later years he did, when the father was around more, and following the report of the affair, of his father's 8-year affair.
Now, It's your understanding, is it not, from the materials and from Eric's testimony, that the father in the early years' mode of punishment was beating with a belt?
Yes.
And so how do you put in context, then, a mother who would blame a child for her failings, report him to the father, knowing he's going to be beaten with a belt for something he didn't do?
Well, that put Eric in an uncompromising position. It locked him in. He couldn't turn anywhere. The mother kept or I don't know who had the belt on the coffee table, but the belt belonged to the father, and the belt was kept on the coffee table. And then there was a belt that was kept in Eric's closet, which was used for punishment. And in one of the interviews I read, I know that Eric had moved the belt. Somebody had moved the belt, and Eric got into a lot of trouble for having done that.
I believe it was Eric moved the belt and was punished by his father for moving it. You recall that?
Yes.
Objection. This was passed on.
Sustained. The answer's correct.
This is a report that you relied on in forming your opinion?
Yes.
Now, my question, though, was what does it say about a mother who would set a child up blameless, make him take the blame, knowing that he's going to be beaten with a belt for something he didn't do? What does that tell us about the mother?
Objection. Irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, Your Honor, I'd like to be heard on that.
Well, that's one something else.
Is that terrorizing behavior by the mother? In other words, if she has this knowledge, then is her doing that terrorizing behavior?
Objection. Irrelevant.
You're asking about the impact it could have on the child?
Yes. That's behavior to terrorize a child.
The psychological impact would be terrorization
Okay. Now, in the
and isolation.
In the same developmental period, did you make an assessment of the behavior by the mother that constituted denying emotional needs of Eric?
Yes, throughout all the developmental periods.
And what were the specifics, though, during this developmental period that constituted denying emotional needs?
Well, I think one of the most significant ones, and perhaps this has already been talked about, was Eric was taught how to get rid of tears because crying was not an acceptable behavior in the family, not tolerated by either of the parents. And his method, and I think it was during this period that he began to call himself Hurt Man, there would be tears, and his mother taught him to put water in his eyes and then expose his eyes to the air, and that would get rid of the tears. When I asked him if that worked, he said yes, in fact, that had been helpful to him.
To get rid of the tears?
To get rid of the tears.
Was there any indication that along with teaching him how to hide the tears, she gave him any comfort for whatever it was that was causing him to cry?
No, she was unable to comfort him.
Well, what do you mean by unable? Did she try and fail?
She didn't try. At least I couldn't find any place in any of the interviews where there was any attempt to comfort the child.
Then why do you say unable rather than unwilling or uninterested?
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
Why do you use the word unable? Do you mean emotionally unable?
Emotionally unable. Emotionally, the term we use is unavailable for some reason.
Okay, and that reason could be either based on her character or willful, could it not?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, when you use the term unavailable, are you making a determination as to whether she is helplessly unavailable, or anybody is against their own desires unavailable, or willfully unavailable?
Yes,
Could it be either?
it can be that and other reasons.
Well, what other reasons?
Objection. Irrelevant.
Sustained.
Did you ever see any indication that Mrs. Menendez made herself available for comfort to Eric?
May I ask you a question about,
No.
have you clarified the...
If you don't understand the question, I'll ask it again. You've talked already that you saw no evidence of her ever being comforting or supporting in any of the information. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you see any evidence that she ever tried to be?
I recall one time that Eric was promised, and this is a report, self-report by Eric, that his mother, if he won some sort of a tennis tournament or tennis game, that she would bake him a pumpkin pie. And that was very significant to him because his memory was that was really the only time he felt that Mom was going to reward something that he had done. And that appeared to be not comforting when he was hurt, but more rewarding for performance.
Okay. Now, was there anything about Mrs. Menendez's dealing with his nightmare?
And it's a conditional thing. You only get it if you win. You only get it. You only get the pumpkin pie that is special for you, that I make for you, if you win. So it's conditional, and it's not even... That's the only nice thing that she's done for him.
Fears or his nightmares that fell into the category of denying emotional needs?
Not only denying of emotional needs, but terrorization, because the way the nightmares were handled when Eric was a child is he would be put into a cold tub of water to wake him up.
Yes.
From the nightmare. And that's the way he was comforted, which
Is that
I do
comforting?
not find comforting. I find that not only unresponsive, but actively terrorizing.
And you're familiar with the anecdote that Eric related in his testimony about his mother and father colluding to terrify him with a mask in a closet when he was already fearful.
Yes, I remember that.
So would that constitute active terrorizing?
That would constitute active terrorizing.
Now,
I remember that, I believe, in a later period.
I believe it was the Pennington house, so it would be this period.
Okay,
Yeah.
All right. Concerning Eric's learning disabilities, was there evidence of those during the years that he was 6 to 12?
Yes, there was.
And was there any evidence that during those years, 6 to 12, there was any effort to address those disabilities in the home?
No, there was no evidence.
Now, you've already testified to some of the things that were done during this period that constituted isolation. And I think one of the things you testified to was this being placed in the closet periodically to do homework.
Yes.
Were there any other behaviors? And by the way, the incidents that you're familiar with, okay, are those, do you believe that, based on your understanding of how patterns of abuse tend to be repeated, are these the total extent of all things that ever happened to Eric, or is this just a sampling?
Objection to the form of the question, Your Honor. That's
When you
repeated.
say, is this, or these things, what did you refer to?
To the specific incidents that have been reported through witnesses and through Eric's report to you.
Again, the same thing.
All right. Based on your work with children, Dr. Tyler, clinically speaking, do children remember every single thing that ever happened to them?
No, none of us do.
And based on your assessment of psychological maltreatment, is that based on looking for patterns that repeat themselves over and over again?
Yes, I believe I've talked about the importance of patterns, particularly when it comes to maltreatment of children. Patterns over a period of time, patterns over generation, and you look for those to see if there's specific things that happen, almost with predictability after you we're all entitled to one mistake, but a pattern is something that's very significant, particularly in this area.
And in your studies of psychological maltreating parents, do they tend to repeat those behaviors? If you find a discernible pattern, does that tend to define repetitive behavior on their part?
That is one thing that we know, and the literature would support that.
You're asking if they've done it once as a child, they would do it more than once?
Yes. That's all I'm asking. Is this the way they tend to behave? When
This
you
is the
find
way-
a pattern, does this tell you that this is how this parent tends to behave on these issues towards this child?
That is correct. A parent who has established a pattern without outside intervention, some sort of social service agency coming in or some sort of therapeutic intervention, would tend to continue with that kind of parenting behavior.
Okay, my question is this. You've heard about many, many incidents that occurred between Mrs. Menendez and Eric that
Yes, I
you
have.
have assessed as constituting patterns of psychological
That is
maltreatment.
correct.
Do you have any reason to believe that with respect to all other times in his life, she behaved differently than what is reflected in the patterns established by these incidents?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled.
I have no reason to believe that her treatment of Eric changed.
What I'm asking is, do you think you have heard about everything that she would have done?
I'm sure I have not heard about everything because I think it would be impossible to have every incident of this boy's life on paper or for him to have memory, particularly now that I know what the memory deficit was that this child was dealing with the new material I received yesterday. I would not have expected Eric to remember everything.
The material that you received yesterday was from what source, Dr. Tyler?
That material came from the Lewis School in Pennsylvania.
New Jersey, I believe.
Or New Jersey, and
Okay, and do you recall from that material at what age Eric was involved with the Lewis School?
I believe he was taken there at age 15 and a half.
And do you recall how long it was that he was attending the Lewis School?
I think it was a short period of time to have, several weeks to have remedial tutoring for mathematics. He was taken to see if the school, which specializes in working with learning disabilities in children and attention deficit disorders, he was taken there by his mother to see if they could tutor him to bring his math performance up.
Now, let me ask you something. From the materials that you saw, did the Lewis School routinely administer a wide variety of tests?
Yes, they did. I looked at the list of tests that he should have received, and then, in fact, the testing that was done.
And was he fully tested?
No, he was not. I understand that permission was denied.
By whom?
Your Honor, move to strike. I understand, and everything after that is being hearsay.
Sustained. Answer straight.
Well, does the fact that you received, did this information that you received from the Lewis School contribute to your opinion that Eric's learning disabilities were not dealt with appropriately by the parents and constituted psychological maltreatment under the category of denying emotional needs?
Objection, compound, calls for improper opinion.
Sustained.
Did you rely upon this information from the Lewis School in formulating your opinion?
I did.
And did it inform your opinion concerning the denial of emotional needs by depriving Eric of the remedial work he needed for his learning disabilities?
It did.
And is it your understanding, based on those materials, that the parents would not allow him to be fully tested?
That is
Your Honor,
correct.
move to strike is hearsay.
Objection sustained. The answer straight.
Well, I'd like to approach on this, Your Honor.
Yes.
In reviewing the records from the Lewis School, Dr. Tyler, did you did that make you aware of specific learning disabilities that Eric was experiencing at 15 and a half?
Yes, it did.
And would you just briefly just list what the names of those disabilities were as reflected in their test records?
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't know if I have the report with me, but I think I can remember sufficiently. If you have the report, I'd like to see it.
Well, why don't you try to remember, and then if you miss anything...
Well, I
I'll
think
try to
one of the
report.
things that was the most striking is the, well, first of all, I was struck with the fact that there wasn't any extensive psychological testing given the, there was one projective test given, and having looked at that one projective test, I was concerned that further tests had not been allowed. But from the tests that were given, it was, it appeared as if Eric had some very significant difficulties in dysgraphia, which is a problem with writing. He had some reading problems.
A problem with the physical act of
with
writing?
the physical act of writing. He had a problem with memory, and it was seen throughout short-term, long-term memory problems.
Was there something, is that what's referred to as dysnomia?
Dysnomia.
And
Memory, problems with memory for names of things.
names,
Get mixed
places,
up.
dates,
Names,
titles?
places, dates, titles.
And what about dyslexia? Was there a finding of that?
Yes.
And was there a finding of attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity?
Well, that finding was suspected. It needed to be corroborated by reports from teachers and reports from parents. And none of that cooperation, as far as I could tell, was allowed by the Menendez family.
Now, I'd like to try to move through some of this other material concerning the actual psychological maltreatment that Eric experienced at the hands of both of his parents. So what I'd like to do is the things that you've talked about as beginning in the 6 to 12 period concerning Mrs. Menendez's way of expressing rejection and degradation and her method of terrorizing and the manners in which she denied emotional needs, did all of those continue through the next period?
Yes, they did.
Now,
in one form or another.
Now, in the next period, which is adolescence 13 to 18, was there, however, a set of behaviors on Mrs. Menendez's part that were particularly significant in Eric's perception of himself and perception of the family?
Yes, which category?
Well, we're talking mainly with respect to Mrs. Menendez's mental condition leaving her to write a suicide letter.
This was a period of time.
Now, what period are you talking about?
The 13 to 18, if you move to that period.
Okay, let me ask you some
12 to
questions.
18.
Concerning, are you aware of the fact that she left a suicide letter and that she left it on purpose for Eric to find?
I am aware of that.
Objection, calls for speculation as to leaving it on purpose for her son to find.
Well, are you aware of a statement that she made to Dr. Summerfield that she left it on purpose for Eric to find?
Move to strike as hearsay.
Your Honor, I think that comes in as statement. Thank you.
Yes, on reviewing that therapy information that was disclosed
By her to Dr. Summerfield.
by Mrs. Menendez to Dr. Summerfield, that she left this letter threatening suicide on purpose for Eric to find.
And did she also reveal that she knew full well that Eric found it?
Yes, she did.
And did she also reveal that Lyle responded to it and contacted her and to try to support her?
Your Honor, objection, hearsay.
Yes, the information that I read was that Eric had become very frightened and had called his brother. Eric was alone. He was in a new house, a new school, and pretty much alone in the house with his mom and feeling, I think, extremely responsible. And he was very fearful, and of course, as any child would be. And I saw this as a very vicious act on the part of a mother.
Why would you characterize it as vicious? Why is it vicious if she's feeling badly that she leaves a suicide letter around for her 16-year-old son to find?
Objection irrelevant.
Well, what category did you put this act of hers in?
I categorize this as terrorizing.
And why is it terrorizing for her to leave the suicide letter for her child to find?
Well, this was a child who, as we've known throughout his history of his relationship with his mother, had felt very responsible for how his mother felt. Her anger, her rages, she made him responsible for her own tardiness, her own forgetfulness. And he loved his mother. And to pick up a letter like this and be all alone would be terrorizing. I think terrorizing for any child. And it's viewed clinically as a real act of hostility
Towards the child?
towards the child.
Is this the kind of thing that would frighten a child?
Yes, I said it would not only frightened, I think in this case it was terrorizing.
And my question, though, had been, did you also verify from Dr. Summerfield's notes that Lyle responded
Yes.
in a supportive way to try to help her?
Objection, calls for double hearsay.
Sustained to the former question.
Okay. Did you recall from Dr. Summerfield's notes that Mrs. Menendez told Dr. Summerfield that the chain of events was she left the letter, Eric found it, Eric contacted Lyle, Lyle called her?
Yes. And Mrs. Menendez then blamed Eric for her troubles.
Blamed Eric?
And Lyle. Lyle offered to come home. Lyle offered in a letter to his, or in this conversation to his mother, and this was reported to Summerfield, that Lyle offered to make things better and have Eric and his mother live with him, and he was going to try to fix it. And Mrs. Menendez was very angry about that. And although she reported to her therapist that she was touched by Lyle's concern, she did not want any part of that.
Now, is this, you had talked early on about one component of psychological maltreatment being when a parent uses a child to meet their own needs.
That's correct. I did talk about that. That is one of the things that we look at in terms of the total picture of psychological maltreatment, is when a parent uses a child as an extension of themselves to get their needs met. A parent who's unable to allow the child to have their own life.
And is there information in Dr. Summerfield's notes and his opinions that Mrs. Menendez's attitude towards her children was only seen from the perspective of how they could meet her needs, rather than how she could meet theirs?
Objection, hearsay.
Objection sustained. It is hearsay. You'll have to frame it some other way as to whether or not this witness relied upon such information for such purpose. But again, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that the witness relates this information doesn't establish that the information that is related, that these events actually happened. It's just information that she is using to form certain opinions. She assumes that these things happen and therefore uses it as a basis for certain opinions that she expresses.
Okay. In assessing Mrs. Menendez's maltreating behavior of denying emotional needs, did you rely, at least in part, on the information from Dr. Summerfield?
I did.
And how did that information inform your opinion concerning denying needs or how needs were dealt with in this family system?
The information that I used was Dr. Summerfield's description of what Mrs. Menendez had reported to him and what his diagnosis of her was.
And how did that relate to, if you could just tell us the bottom line, which is about...
Dr. Summerfield talked about something called narcissism, which is a psychological term, psychiatric term.
Your Honor, I move to strike this testimony as being hearsay.
It's not being
As
offered.
to Dr. Summerfield's analysis.
Well, let's objection sustained as to that portion of the answer, and you may re-ask questions a different way.
The issue is, what is the information contained from Dr. Summerfield's materials that you are relying on that tells you about Mrs. Menendez's meeting or...
It's not hearsay, and she's an expert. She can talk to this. She can speak about this kind of thing.
or not meeting the emotional needs of her child.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Sustained. If counsel want to approach and discuss the issue.
Yes.
All right.
Dr. Tyler, hold on. Let me ask you a question. Did you find support?
Without giving us the underlying information, did you find support in Dr. Summerfield's materials for your opinion of Mrs. Menendez as a person who denied the emotional needs of her kids and used them to fulfill her own needs?
I found strong support of that.
Or that she's a narcissist.
Was there any significance in your assessment of Mrs. Menendez and her psychological maltreatment of Eric in these years to the fact that she bought a rifle and made a statement that someone's going to be killed?
Yes, I did make note of that.
What was the significance of that particular episode?
I think the significance of that episode is, again, a form of terrorization of a child, and also a form of isolation. It enhances, in a child's mind, enhances the power that the mother has. She now has a firearm.
And is there any indication that Eric would believe that she was not capable of using it?
I have no indication of that in the material that I have reviewed.
Is there any indication in the material that Eric would believe that she is capable of using it?
Yes.
Calls for speculation.
Sustain. The answer is stricken.
You reviewed Eric's testimony where he believed that she would use it, did you not?
I did.
Is there anything about her behavior up until that point that was inconsistent with that belief?
There was not.
Now, I want to turn to Mr. Menendez, if we can. And with respect to Mr. Menendez, could you characterize briefly the basic psychological maltreatment patterns that you saw with respect to him over the course of Eric's life?
Over the course of Eric's life, with respect to Mr. Menendez...
If you could just give us a general picture.
Okay. Well, the rejection and degrading definitely was part of that picture because Eric's perception of his relationship with his dad and also other family members and Coach's perception of Eric's relationship with his dad was that he was not important to his father. Certainly not important in the way that his older brother was. He wasn't as good a tennis player. He wasn't. He didn't think he was as smart. And he didn't give Eric the one-on-one attention that he gave the older son. In addition, when Eric was given a tennis coach, it was always the coach that wasn't as good as the coach that coached his other brother. So the messages throughout Eric's growing up were that Dad was rejecting of him.
Let me ask you
Dad
something.
called him names.
What was the most distinctive component, though, of the way that Jose Menendez ran his family? What was the thing he relied upon to do that?
He relied upon his position of power. He was Eric told me that he and his brother viewed his father as all-knowing, knew everything. He was very smart. He was very powerful in the business world. He was ruthless. He cut through everything to achieve the end.
What role, if any, did fear play in the way Mr. Menendez ran the family?
Eric was very fearful of his father.
Well, did Mr. Menendez use fear? Was it deliberate?
Yes, he used fear.
Was terrorizing the chief component of his maltreatment?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
What significance did terrorizing have as an aspect of Mr. Menendez's maltreatment of the children?
It had a very significant effect on both children. Certainly Eric, the terrorization over the years of the alleged sexual maltreatment.
Did you find terrorizing only in conjunction with the sexual maltreatment, or were there other examples of Mr. Menendez terrorizing his son?
Well, there were all kinds of examples. Probably a lot of these incidents have been recounted.
Are you familiar with the testimony of other witnesses who indicated that they found Mr. Menendez intimidating and frightening?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any reason to believe that he acted less intimidating or less frightening with his children?
I have no reason to believe that.
And with respect to the perspective of a child, with the person who adults find intimidating and terrorizing, what is the likely impact of that individual on a child?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
So with respect to Mr. Menendez in particular, you made an assessment of his impact on Eric with respect to fear-inducing behaviors.
Is that a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And what was the impact on Eric of his father's intimidation, his strength, and his fear-inducing behaviors?
The impact upon Eric was that he thought his father could hurt him, and that his father told him very definitely that what he did to him was not ever to be revealed to anybody, because if he did, he would be killed.
And what does that produce in a child when you're warned to keep a secret and there's a threat of death if you don't? Does that itself fit into another category of psychological maltreatment besides just terrorizing?
Besides terrorization and besides exploiting and besides denying emotional needs, it very definitely isolates the child because the child has no place to go.
Would a child risk telling this secret when a parent like Mr. Menendez has threatened death upon revelation?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, in your study of children, you've studied children who were sexually molested as well.
Yes, I have.
And you studied children who were in abusive families where parents threaten harm to the children if they do certain things or if they reveal the secrets.
Yes,
Do those children tend to tell?
Those children do not tend to tell. It is very rare for a child to tell until they feel like they've got some safety of some sort.
And is that why
Children don't tell until they're 40, 50 years old. And often after the perpetrator is deceased. Only then do children tell, very often. Because of that terror, that threat.
Can children be controlled with fear and threats?
Absolutely.
Now, was isolating a key component of the psychological maltreatment practiced by Mr. Menendez?
Yes, I think isolating within the family for this boy, he was threatened not to tell anybody within the family. He certainly couldn't tell outside of the family. He was told that his mother was his father's friend, and so he knew that he couldn't go to her. He had been treated in such a way by his mother that this child could not have felt that mother could intervene. When he would go into the room with his father and the door would be locked, and then come out of the room and go to the bathroom and vomit, there was no intervention. And if you don't have intervention when that happens, how can you have intervention for anything else? The type of maltreatment of this isolation from folks outside the family, even though Eric played tennis, he had coaches, he went to an expensive school, he had a lot of material advantages. That didn't make the difference. He was still very, very isolated. The coaches changed over a period of time so that he never really had an opportunity to develop an intimate, trusting relationship with the coach. And the coaches had been intimidated by the father anyway.
And with respect to the teachers, did you see a similar pattern that although he had contact with a lot of teachers, the teachers were intimidated by these parents?
Yes, I read in report on report of the teachers that this man was intimidating.
Did you ever see any evidence that any of the teachers tried to intervene, even those who seemed to realize there was something wrong with the family?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Would Eric have, based on the material you've seen, would Eric have ever experienced a teacher intervening on his behalf? Is there any evidence that that ever happened?
I read one report given by a teacher where the teacher had tried to suggest to Mr. Menendez something about Eric's absences from school because of his tennis, I believe it was, but she was making a suggestion that was in Eric's best interests, and she was rebuffed, and she then withdrew and stated that there wasn't anything that she could do.
My question is, though, did you see any evidence whatsoever that anyone actually did intervene to Eric's knowledge, any teacher?
No, I didn't see that.
Did you see?
I saw attempts, but it was never carried through.
Did you ever see any indication that any teacher ever even went to Eric and said, "Kid, I know you're in a bad situation. I feel sorry for you," or "I empathize"? Anything like that, even?
No.
Now, is that kind of an outreach by an adult? Can that help? Is that an intervention that could help a kid in an abusive family? If a teacher or coach says, "Boy, you know, those people are miserable. I side with you." I mean, even that, can that help?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Can that ameliorate some of the damage of psychological maltreatment if it occurs?
Well,
Objection.
Sustained.
Well, do you see
If
any?
there was any indication of that, did you see it? Did you see any such efforts made by anybody? You've answered that no, is that right?
yes, that's correct.
Are those considered ameliorating events?
Those are considered ameliorating events.
And did you see any evidence of ameliorating events, such as intervention by other adults in this family?
I did not. I saw attempts, but no intervention.
Now, is there another kind of ameliorating event? For example, what role, if any, did the athletics play in Eric's adjustment or in his development? I mean, apart from the pressure from the parents, is there any positive side to the athletics?
Yes, I think the athletics were probably very definitely a way that this boy could achieve some success in his life. And some release of tension, some physical exercise.
And are those things helpful in for abused children to be able to cope with the abuse that's going on if there is some ameliorating event like athletics or a release of tension?
Very definitely.
Now, returning, well, it is noon, Your Honor.
All right, we'll recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss the
All right, and that is where I'm going to stop it for today. And we will pick up with part 2 of Ann Tyler on Thursday. So make sure you are subscribed. Please don't forget to hit the like button on your way out. And I look forward to seeing you guys on Thursday. Take care. Bye now. If you've been impacted by a true crime and would like your story told in your own words, or if you or someone you know has been wrongfully convicted or accused of a crime, please write to crimeincourtchannel@gmail.com and tell us your real true crime encounters. Thanks for watching.